As he left the river, Ruji was left thinking of all the people bathing in the river. Already, it was a bit chilly. He wasn't sure if it was spring or fall here. For that matter, though the weather felt a bit chilly to him, this could be the local summer or even the dead of winter. He didn't know enough about the world yet and figured he should probably talk to Karen about it. If it was going to get colder, he certainly didn't want to come to the river to wash his hair. If it got colder, how would the locals bathe? He dreaded the thought of the adorable little catgirl having to freeze to take a bath. Then an idea occurred to him. If it was too expensive for locals to bathe indoors, why didn't he just make several public bathhouses? He would have several things to overcome, but that was just the kind of thing he needed. That would be the ultimate way to launder his money. He would have a monopoly on them since they apparently weren't a thing. That meant that he would be able to charge as little as he wanted or as much. He considered the people at the bathing at the river, and before his mind could stray to the scene of all the nude women, he diverted his mind to the conditions that would make them bathe there, in the nude. Gah, he couldn't get that image out of his head. Still, the price would need to be low enough that the average person could afford to use them. But why use the bathhouses if the river was free? He pondered this for a moment, before remembering what had attracted the attention of all the women there. That would be the ticket. He now had his next destination. He walked over to the stand he had in mind. The beast-folk woman of indeterminate species was already finished setting out her wares and was calling to passers-by to try getting their interest. When she saw him coming, she got a big smile. She had only recently made a decent bit of coin off of this very elf, and she saw the opportunity coming to make even more. Ruji smiled at her and felt a slight itch on his ear. Before he realized it, he was flicking his ears to try removing the offending itch. It was only now that he was realizing how mobile his ears were. He scratched his ear, but decided he would have to explore that a bit further later. I was actually wondering, how much soap can you get? You don't happen to make your own, do you? As he asked this question, she got a look of slight trepidation and looked off to the side. When he looked where she had glanced, he realized it was a hatter stand that he had previously made a contract with and thought she might have the wrong idea. I never put pressure on anybody to make a deal, you know. The only one that I have had to coerce was the older brother of the boy selling meat skewers. I wouldn't have done that if I weren't worried that the boy might die of illness. He looked back and saw that she was staring wide-eyed at him. I have deals with a number of businesses, but I won't force anybody to make a deal. I also don't want much from these deals. She wore a skeptical look and her one-word reply was very telling. Why? Ruji smiled as charmingly as he could. I mostly want to be able to collect a little bit over a long period of time from them. Unless you were asking about the boy. In his case, I just don't like the idea of leaving anybody to their fate. I would risk my own life or even sacrifice it if needed to rescue a child, and I want you to realize what I mean by that. At these words, he pulled the chain around his neck up enough for the woman to see the small silver and gold bar-shaped pendant on it. As he dropped the pendant proclaiming his nobility back into his shirt, her eyes went wider and she bowed her head. No need for that, I'm not the type to stand on my title. Why do you think I wear it under my shirt? However, add that to what you know of most nobles. I really would die to save even one child. I have plans that will save many more, however, that is going to take a lot of time. While the woman was deep in thought, he broached the subject he wanted to ask about in a strategic move to drop her guard. As a small part of that plan, I need a steady and fairly sizable supply of soap. Yes, soap. So I ask again, are you the one who makes it? Suddenly, she looked a little abashed and answered in slight disappointment. No, my lord. I make the perfumes and colognes. My brother is the one who makes the soaps. Ruji was afraid she was going to say she bought them, but this could actually work out quite well. He perused her stand and looked over her prices for a moment in consideration before replying. This cheapest perfume and that cheap cologne, can those be made any cheaper? The woman looked bewildered by the questions at first and then she seemed to grow indignant. Ruji realized that it might have sounded like he was telling her to lower the price for him, so he hurriedly continued. I just wonder, if they were made in larger batches, would they be cheap enough to sell in my general store? If so, they might be a good thing to sell at the other store I had in mind as well. I could certainly see the more expensive ones selling at the one I planned to build in the Nobles district. He pretended not to have noticed her indignant look from earlier as he looked at her now thoroughly confused expression. I wonder, would you be interested in perhaps having a shop where you could make larger batches of these for me to sell in several different shops around the city? I would need to talk to your brother about the soap part though. That is a critical part of my plan. The woman took several minutes to process all of what he had said. Afterward, she agreed to meet him the next morning and bring her brother along. Ruji left her in a daze, but not before replacing his missing bar of soap and washing linen. After that, he went to the magic shop and spent the morning in instruction under Dorn. Having learned the generalities of the script, Dorn wanted to see if he could write any. He was pleasantly surprised again by how quickly Ruji picked up on his lessons. They had a quick lunch of cold things Dorn had fixed that morning for breakfast when he had expected Ruji to be by early. After apologizing, Ruji astounded the old dwarf again by turning bread, bacon, cheese, and eggs into a sandwich. Lunch out of the way, it was back to practicing mana control and writing. The glyphs were easy enough to draw out in the air, but then Dorn threw him a curveball. Apparently, the glyphs he was drawing out would need to be roughly 1/3 the size he was drawing them in order to be usable in drawing magic circles. Dorn just watched in silent judgment as Ruji dipped a finger into a tube of ground rock and brought it back out to study it. He began by trying to apply less mana, but that just made it fade. Next, he tried to narrow the focus of his mana on the end of his finger, but he couldn't keep it steady enough to draw straight lines like that even if he did get the lines narrow enough. It took Ruji more than an hour to finally figure out that he could focus his mana when he stuck it into the tube. Doing that allowed him to draw out a thin stick of the powder that he could then draw thinner lines with. When he finally figured it out, Dorn just whistled loudly and began grinning like a demented tanuki figure. He came over and clapped Ruji on the shoulder a couple times before exclaiming in a loud voice. I had me suspicions, but now I be a knowin'. Ye had to be been a wizard before. I'll be a goblin's uncle if ye weren't. Ye gots a feel ferret. I didn't tell ye how ta be doin' that and ye figured it out anyway. And ye be figurin' it out in a bit o' no time. After that it was practice drawing with the fine sticks of powder. When Dorn had to deal with a customer, Ruji tried to see just how fine he could make his powder. After a few tries, he managed to pull out what was practically a needle of powdered stone. The result of drawing with a tip so fine was that he ended up with a headache from how hard he had to concentrate to keep it that way. After getting the headache, Ruji checked his mana, but it was fine. When Dorn came back, he told Ruji to just spend the rest of the day taking it easy. Having a few more things he wanted to do in the back of the shop, he told Ruji to just dust and sweep the shop and then he could go home for the day. Ruji spent the next 2 hours cleaning every nook and cranny of the shop. The dirty condition of the shop had been annoying him anyway, and he was used to cleaning both the classroom at school and his house. He remembered how Haruko used to harp on him about making sure the house was spotless so their mom didn't get sick from the dust and nearly broke down crying. He stopped in his cleaning and said a silent prayer to the gods that his mother would survive the news of his death. He began wondering how everyone was back on Earth. In order to kick his mind out of that depressing line of thought, he began thinking of things he could perhaps start selling to legitimize his money. He was already set on doing the bathhouses, one way or another. He thought about the general store and realized that it was a lot like a convenience store. He might be able to work with that and turn it into a chain store. Another thing that went well in a convenience store would be a pharmacy. His own general store had a small selection of some kind of medications it looked like. What else? In that way, he passed the rest of his time cleaning and thinking. When he finally finished wiping down the last of the tables full of items for sale, he realized he was out of things to clean and yelled to Dorn that he was leaving for the day. Karen was surprised to see him back so early, and when he told her that he had been cleaning all afternoon, she seemed a little more than skeptical. When his assurance that he wasn't kidding failed to impress her, he took it as a challenge. As she was in the midst of cleaning the rooms, he told her he was going to help and ended up making her depressed when he did a better job cleaning than her. After that, he spent the next hour explaining what all he had done and giving her pointers. After that was supper, journal entry, and bed. Ruji got another early start the next day. After finishing his morning routine, he went downstairs to the common room and it was a bit more occupied than the previous morning. He went over and sat at the bar and Karen came out to greet him. He couldn't resist a quiet little jab. "Ah, no kiss this morning?" That got the desired blush and after a glance around to see if anybody was watching, she even leaned forward and gave him a quick peck on the lips. "You know, I'm still mad that you know how to clean better than me. What kind of noble elf lord knows how to clean like that?" "Oh well, I'll be right back. I already put the loaf of bread in the oven when I saw you coming down and I'm sure it's warm by now. I even put butter on it." Karen sat the loaf between them and began to cut it. Just then one of the customers called for her and she had to go wait their table. When she came back, she wore a grin. One of the customers wanted to know how much they would have to pay to get a loaf of bread like that. I told him that he could try buying a bakery for a baker. Karen was right on the brink of bursting out in laughter at her little joke. Ruji just rolled his eyes with a light chuckle, then yelled to the guy in the back. "I paid her a large copper to make some bread with either berries or nuts in it. I think the berries are out of season, but you can always ask the young lady that sells the bread in the nearest plaza." Karen almost burst out laughing at that comment. She could just imagine the guy looking for some young girl selling bread in the plaza instead of old Lisbeth. After she calmed down a bit, they chatted a bit about his plans for businesses as they ate and he had a question for her. "Where do you bathe? I know that most of the people in the city either wash using basin and rag or they go to the river. I saw plenty of them there yesterday." Karen got a slightly peeved look on her face. "Why would you go to the river? We provide hot water every morning. Do you go there to watch women bathe?" He looked her in the eye with a smirk. "Oh, but of course. I actually go there to wash my hair. It would have too much soap in it to get it all out in a basin. I don't like my hair to be heavy and oily." The moment he said it, Karen looked away with an aggrieved expression and began feeling of her hair. "I see. That's why your hair always looks so good and mine is like this. I just use a basin and I wash my hair without any soap. I actually don't have any soap at all." Ruji was almost certain that if he weren't an elf he wouldn't have heard her last comment. "I had an idea. I was thinking about opening a bunch of bathhouses that commoners could use and a nicer one for the nobles. I also noticed that there was a large open space beside the inn that currently only has firewood in it. I thought I might see if Teresa was interested in having a bathhouse attached to the inn. I would pay for it, of course. I think I'll talk to her about it later." At first, Karen was in a daze, but then she brightened up so much that Ruji could tell she really liked the idea. Ruji left a bit after that and took the last of the berry loaf with him for Dorn to try. However, when he got near the plaza, Lisbeth came walking over to him and she was carrying a pair of fresh baked nut loaves. Thanking her profusely, Ruji then suggested using the base dough to make rings and twists and serving them with dried, grated garlic or a dry grated cheese on them. She didn't understand grating, so he suggested finely crumbled and she looked at him like he was a food wizard. After parting ways with Lisbeth, he went to the magic shop and discovered Dorn still fast asleep. He decided to pull out the fresh loaves and was going to use his dagger to cut a slice when he made a startling discovery. His dagger was rusted. A cursory examination showed him his sword was also. He instead pulled Dorn's kitchen knife out of the butcher's block and cut a slice of the fresh loaf for himself and one for Dorn. After taking a bite, Ruji got a great idea. He got out his quill and inkwell, then pulled a page from his tome for writing practice and proceeded to do just that. He tried several times to compose a letter to Dorn. On the 6th try, he managed to write a letter to the old dwarf explaining that the slices of bread were his for breakfast if he wanted them and he would be back in a bit. He had an errand to run. Ruji then set about slicing the hardly touched nut loaf into many small slices. He didn't have any butter and lamented that it would be much better with butter. He then wrapped the whole thing up and took out the other to get the same treatment. He left half of that one for his, Karen's, and Teresa's breakfast tomorrow. He then made a quick jaunt a few blocks over to where his employees were just getting things set out in the general store. He spotted Varan at roughly the same time he was spotted and waved him over to the side counter. He grabbed a wax paper-wrapped stick of butter on his way. When Varan saw what he had in his hand, he was rather puzzled till Ruji pulled out the loaves, and he got a big grin. Varan sent a young boy to the apartments to tell the residents that their boss had brought a treat and it was first come first served. Ruji told him to also go fetch the cat beast folk family. The boy seemed hesitant at first and looked at Varan. Well? You heard him. Get going, or it may be you that doesn't get any. After the boy took off, Ruji asked about the business and found that word had already spread about the changes to the business. Varan told him that even though they took a slight hit in farmers coming in to get credit on their crops' yield, the bartering was making money at every turn. He told Ruji that all of the old accounts had been happily reinstated after he paid them off and they discovered that the business was under new ownership. As Ruji was getting the good news about the business and how well it was doing, the first of the workers came to see what the new boss was treating them to. None of them expected to get a slice of buttered nut bread, however thin. After a bit, the cats all slinked in and the bread was just about gone. The older cats pushed the children to the front in hopes that at least they would get a treat. Ruji just grinned as he opened the second loaf and saw everyone just arriving brightened considerably. Ruji was surprised to find the messenger boy was the last one in line and gave him one of the thicker slices with just a little extra butter on it. Turning to Varan, he held out a slice of the fragrant bread and enjoyed hearing all the exclamations about how good it was from everyone. Varan thanked him and savored a big bite of the still warm bread. Ruji was just about to put up the rest of the bread when he heard a little boy wailing about not getting any bread if they didn't hurry. After a few seconds, the bleary-eyed little sun-elf boy and his emaciated mother made it through the door. He smiled and buttered 2 more slices while shooting a questioning look at Varan. Why does she look like that? He practically hissed. Varan was worried at first that he was about to be in deep trouble for something before he recognized the pattern from before. The new owner wasn't mad at him, he was mad at the former owner. She's been sick for the last 8 days. The young manager lowered his voice so Ruji was the only one who could hear before he went on. She has elven blight. It's not deadly unless you can't afford the medicine and nobody has been able to get paid until you showed up, sir. Ruji was so livid that he wanted to go to the dungeon and kill the former owner himself. He had heard that the Duke was reviewing the case and if he ruled that the merchant was guilty, the man would be publicly executed. He shook his head and looked back at Varan. How much is the medicine? Are there any more of my employees sick for lack of simple needs being met? He didn't wait for Varan to answer and slammed a large gold coin down on the counter. Treat those who are ill and the rest is to go into fixing the tenements. I'm sick of hearing about that vile bastard. Varan, I need you to get my people healthy. I'm serious about the increased pay too, for anybody who deserves it. I'm sure that's probably everyone here. Ruji turned to the crowd of his employees who were all either staring at him or the gold coin with wide eyes. I will take care of everyone who works for me, and I can already tell that you are all doing the same for me. Without somebody telling them, the people of the town wouldn't know that the barters and tabs were back. Oh, one thing before I forget. Once it opens, go to the bakery a couple blocks over. Another one of my employees runs it and she's the one who made the bread. I'll make sure that you're all paid enough to enjoy it. The cheering was so loud that Ruji had to cover his ears with a grin and all the elves and cats did too. He then beckoned to the cats to follow him to one side. How's the search for a construction crew going? They all had their faces down looking between each other until one of the husbands spoke up. My lord, we are terribly sorry but we haven't been able to figure out how to get any workers. We were hesitant to bother the lady of the tax office until we ran out of any other options. I'm terribly sorry, my lord sir. Ruji wanted to scowl, but then he caught sight of the younger girl with butter smeared over her whiskers and couldn't help but smile. After wiping the butter off, she grabbed his hand and proceeded to lick it off his finger just like a cat, complete with waving tail. After that, he couldn't stay angry and looked at them with a sidelong glance. Fine, be at the tax office at lunch. I will go in with you, but I won't do your talking for you. And Aline will have to be paid for her services, so bring the money with you. We'll eat after that. Now, I have to go. I have training, so can I have my finger back? The little girl looked abashed, but then immediately hugged his leg and began purring and rubbing her cheek on it before running off. Time to get to the shop. When he entered potions and such, Ruji was treated to the sight of the old dwarf holding a lanky old sun elf by the waist and cursing him for all he was worth. Once he got closer, he could tell the old codger was trying to get a hold of the slices of bread Ruji had left for Dorn. I just want a bite, you stubborn old boulder biter. You wouldn't miss one bite. Rust me toes, I'll be a bit in those boulders before I'll be a giving ye any of the treats me apprentice left fair me. Now get ye goin'. I'll be back any time and ye need na be both airin' him. Go on now, ye old bush muncher. With his harsh words, Dorn gave another concerted effort to evict the very stubborn old elf. Ruji couldn't help but snort a laugh at their antics and blush slightly at an alternate meaning of Dorn's words from his old world. Oh, no need to worry. I'm already here. Dorn master, sir, another uncontrollable snort of laughter. Who's your guest? I have more of the nut bread, by the way. And I even have butter now. Why don't we all enjoy a bit while the two of you calm down before you hurt yourselves? More unintentional laughter. As the two untangled and got embarrassed, Ruji pulled out a few more slices of the nut bread and the butter. The old elf graciously accepted the slice he was handed and Ruji buttered the other 2 pieces of bread for Dorn. When they bit into them, they both seemed like they were much younger. Ruji had to reassess his master after what he had seen when he walked in, and now Dorn wasn't the cold old codger that he acted like most of the time, and now Ruji had glimpsed his childish side, twice. It turned out that the old sun elf was named Silas Moonmeadow and was an old war buddy of Dorn's. The two of them having served in the same mage corps for a number of years, and they had a bunch of war stories. The two chatted back and forth about old times and recounted old battles for hours. Ruji took notes and would occasionally ask questions that both were only too happy to answer. About noon, Ruji told them that he would have to excuse himself, but the two insisted that they would go with him. He just shrugged and invited them to come along if they really wanted. He pulled his book back out and propped it open on his left arm while holding the inkwell with his left hand. He then used his right hand to write the continuing notes with. To say he got strange looks would be an understatement. The strange procession made its way through town. The old dwarf and the old elf semi-leading the way while Ruji followed and took notes. He only interrupted to give directions or ask questions. The pair got a lot of attention as they walked past the Mercenaries Guild. They were apparently rather well known. Thankfully, they didn't stop long enough for the mercenaries to congregate around them. A few minutes later, the 3 of them arrived in front of the tax collector's office. The older 5 cat beast folk were waiting nearby. As soon as they saw Ruji, they all hurried over. Okay, I'll be a moment. When you come in, don't get too loud, okay? As discussed, I'll introduce you, but you're going to have to do the negotiations yourselves. He put his book and writing utensils away. He was careful to lay the sheet of linen inside the book to draw out the excess ink before it could smear when he closed it. He then went to the door of the tax collector's office and knocked. It was only a moment before the soft melodic voice of Aline answered from the other side, telling him to come in. Ruji opened the door and stepped inside. The parlor of the house was just as he remembered it, but he didn't think it would change in a couple days' time. The big wooden desk sat to the right under a high chandelier, and the overstuffed armchair sat on the left, surrounded by bookshelves and facing the desk with a lamp overhanging it. Her butler stood, as per usual, right next to her chair with a tray and a drink of something steaming hot. "Good day, Aline," he said to the elegant late middle-aged woman in the chair. She turned her porcelain white face framed in a halo of long, curly, chocolate-brown hair towards him with a smile that moved the mole under her left eye into the shallow laugh lines, the only wrinkles on her face. "Why, if it isn't Lord Rugy. And what brings you by today? Going to purchase even more properties? Keep that up and you'll end up owning the entire city. Do try not to run out of fortunes too soon, my lord." Rugy smiled at the jab but secretly thought to himself how impossible that would be. "I am simply here to show the way to my tenants today. I'll be waiting to the side as they do the talking." As he said that, he ushered the 5 cats inside and they were followed by Dorn and Silas. Rugy motioned the very nervous cat beast folk forward. The older of the 2 husbands looked at him with almost pleading eyes, and this prompted him to speak. "I told you I would come, but you would have to be the ones to speak. It's your store and you are the ones who need the services." With the last word, he waved his hand to indicate Aline, who for her part seemed rather amused by the whole affair. When none of the others seemed ready to take charge, the bolder of the 2 sisters stepped forward and cleared her throat, gathering her courage. How do you do? My name is Marlies, ma'am." Well, we need your help." She shot me a glance and I just gestured toward Aline. When Aline saw this, she smiled again before asking her to go on. "We have a storefront it needs a bit of work. It needs to be fixed and well, we were hoping you could arrange for a work crew. We have the money to pay for it." Marlies's last sentence was thrust out as though she were worried that everyone was looking for a chance to toss her and her family out the door. She then took the 4 small gold from her father and held them out on her right palm in front of her. Rugy could tell how nervous she was, but he was determined that they had to do this on their own. Rugy saw Dorn's eyes go wide as he saw the gold, and he almost thought he heard something whispered under his breath, but he couldn't make it out. Aline got up and walked over to her desk in no particular hurry. This time Rugy spotted the moment when she made eye contact with the butler, and he took the meaning without the need for words. He bowed and headed off to the back while she settled into her chair behind the desk and gestured for the other woman to take the seat across from her. Marlies looked terrified but took the seat as she had been instructed. The rest of the cats gathered around behind her, probably just glad they weren't the ones having to do the talking. He was a little surprised that Gatto didn't step into that role. It was then that he noticed a warm smile on the oldest of the beast folk and realized it was like the one his own face. So that's what was going on. Once she got started, Marlies was fairly competent and gave a rather accurate description of the condition of the building. She made sure to tell the reason that the building was as moldy as it was, and from her description, it was fairly certain that the cats had been through every room of the building, regardless of how dangerous or insignificant. Once it came to the price, he was only a little surprised when the price stated was roughly 3 times what he was quoted for the bakery. It made sense. The storefront was in much worse condition than the bakery had been. At the mention of money, Rugy could see that Marlies wanted to turn and ask his permission, but to her credit, she stopped herself and made the decision herself. She agreed to the price and the handling charge without complaint. He was impressed. As they were getting to the contract portion, he decided it was a good time to excuse himself, and he got a look of gratitude from the cats before he left. Dorn and Silas immediately started chatting about how cute the 2 daughters had been. Though Rugy could agree, it wasn't really a conversation that he could jump into. Shortly after that, the old guys started walking off and Dorn looked back at Rugy and thought, "Laddie, I dinna be thinking I'll be opening the store again today. I'll see ya in the mornin'. Not too early, mind ye." With that they walked off, and it wasn't long before he heard them start yelling at one another. After only a few minutes, the cats all came rushing out of the door and they began talking about different ideas about how they could change the interior. He guessed that it was mentioned to them by Aline that they could have modifications done while the building was being renovated. Rugy smiled at them and began walking towards the meat skewer stand, and they all followed right after. Once he got to the stand, there was a bit of commotion. The boy at the stand wanted to give him the meat, but he insisted on paying. He told the young dog beast folk boy that he had already collected the 20 skewers that he intended as payment until the next date day. The boy reluctantly accepted the coins and passed out the skewers. Ruji did his customary trick of leading the group over to Lisbeth's stand and ordering a big batch of bread and slipping his skewers into buns during the resulting confusion so that nobody saw him eating meat. Apparently, Sun elves in this world didn't eat meat, but he absolutely craved it. He had of course bought enough skewers and buns for them to take home to their children. He then said his goodbyes to the cats as he left them to eat his meat buns in peace. If only he had some mayonnaise. It didn't take Ruji long to finish his food. He had turned around and headed to the inn to pick up his map and property list and drop off the heavy books beside his writing journal. He then went right back to the tax office. He did have business with Aline, but he wanted to have the cats take care of their own first. He knew that if he had sat down and began discussing his own business, that the cats would have asked him to get the work crew. He was going to force them to grow a backbone. First, he would make them do their own business dealings, and then he would have them interact with customers, and after a while, he was certain that they would get the hang of it. He was a little worried about customers being rude and the cats backing off in fear. He wasn't sure of the best way to handle that though. The husbands were there as protection, so maybe that would be enough. They would actually look the part if he could get them all weapons. Now that he thought about it, that was a great idea. Besides, he needed to know how to treat the rust on his sword anyway. He would go by the weaponsmith's shop after he finished here. He gingerly stepped up to the door and knocked again. Her reply was almost immediate and he let himself in. Aline looked up from behind the desk, a sheaf of papers in front of her. Her surprise was evident. "What can I do for you now, milord? Did your tenants have second thoughts, or was this over a different matter?" "The latter, I'm happy to say." He took the seat across from her at her gesture. He then prepared his thoughts, settling how he would go about phrasing his thoughts. There was little chance that he could broach the subject delicately. Settling on a course of action, he steeled himself for her likely reaction, and she seemed to notice his discomfort. If he could plow through the initial shock, it would be a good way to set the pace of the conversation. "How do you go about bathing?" The shocked reaction was everything he was expecting. The tray clattering to the floor and the sound of a glass breaking in the next room over was not expected, and he winced. "I need to know for market research. Is there a bathhouse in the nobles' district? Does every noble house have a bath for the residents? What about the retainers and guards? I plan to build a few bathhouses in or around the residential districts, but I need to know if the nobles' district would receive it well." Ruji spread his hands with a helpless expression while looking Aline in the eyes and pointedly ignoring her butler, Garin, who was leaning out of the adjoining room glaring at him. "As much as I've been doing recently, I've rather been avoiding mingling with the nobles. I don't really know if there is anyone who might not like me among the aristocracy of the city, but I would rather bide my time in that regard. As a consequence to that line of reasoning, I'm left rather lacking on perspective into the local nobility. You have to deal with them a bit more frequently, and I was hoping to avail myself of your expertise, Madame Aline. I do apologize if I came across rather crass earlier." Ruji could see the wheels spinning in her head, and her expression had been relaxed shortly after the initial shock. Ruji had to marvel once again at the gift of charisma from the Yuma. It was proving almost if not just as useful as the coin pouch. While he did know all of the appropriate words, he was certain that it would never have occurred to him to use them. Aline pondered for a moment longer before looking down and then back at him with a grin spreading across her pretty features. "I have a bath in my home and bathe quite regularly. However, I believe that the information you are truly after would be the likely success and backlash from that if you were to build the bathhouse you are proposing. I can see you having great success in opening a number of them in the commoner districts, and that will always bring you jealousy from someone. If you were to build in the nobles' district, you would need to buy 2 buildings. You would need to have a bath reserved for the nobles even if they were unlikely to visit the facility. To build solely for commoners would likely be called an insult even if the parties in question had no intention of ever going to one. Such is the way that many lower nobles vie for reputation. They would likely bait you into some verbal play and claim that not offering a service to the nobility was an insult and insist on some form of reparations. At least, that's what I believe. Her look was serious and contemplative, but there was an edge of self-interest to it. Ruji considered her words and decided that she was probably right, or at least, she had a decent argument. Likely, she was also contemplating the extra gold that she would garner from the sale of another piece of property. There were a scant few properties on offer in the nobles' district after all. Still, he thought for a second he saw a look of longing. Perhaps, if he built such facilities, she would have an excuse to mingle more freely with those closer to her station. Either way, he had made up his mind. I have an idea. I would like to see what you think of this idea. What if I bought both properties at the same time, but waited a bit to begin work on the one for the nobility? It would likely take a bit of time for the word to get around that the commoners had such facilities, and only once notice was taken would not having the second facility become a risk. I could therefore postpone work on it until I had garnered some information from the servants whom I would hope were frequenting the facility in order to better cater to the tastes of the nobility. Before he was even done explaining the idea, her eyes went wide, and then she got a very calculating look in her eyes. Why, my lord, I do believe you have come to a very astute conclusion. I would further like to say that if you do indeed build a facility for the servants and retainers, I would gladly volunteer to collect the odd bit of information to prepare you to open the second facility. And if perchance I happen to overhear conversation about one of the nobility preparing to cause trouble for you, I would then be able to give you a bit of advance warning. Of course, I might ask for a bit of a discount from you for my services. Ruji leaned forward and both of them shared a big conspiratorial grin before pressing their fists together over the desk. Madam, I do believe we have reached an accord. I would like to begin discussing the purchase of various properties. Ruji pulled out his map and list to look over the ones that he had marked in various ways. Before we begin on that, I would like to inform you of the unfortunate condition of certain properties. I doubt that their current condition is known to you and thought you might want to have an update on their conditions. There are a couple buildings that were pointed out to me as having both mold and wood bugs. I'm no expert, but I would think the latter to be cause for concern. Aline looked almost horrified at the mention of the apparent pest and confirmed through a description of their appearance that they were indeed termites. It didn't take long to point out to her the 3 buildings that the cats had said smelled of the pests. Aline was terribly thankful for the information. She then explained that if a wealthy merchant or a noble bought a property that was infested with the vermin, that they could hold judgment against her for not listing the damages and adjusting the price accordingly. Then she went on to list a worst-case scenario where a noble was injured in one of the buildings due to her lacking information. Ruji then told her that she should look into hiring some beast folk to inspect the buildings. She had a skeptical look on her face, and that's when he informed her that he had the information only because of the little cat girl. Suddenly, she looked a lot more receptive to the idea. It was time for a final push. He then went on to say that if she were to adopt a beast folk child, that they would be exceedingly loyal and were incredibly cute when they rubbed on your leg and purred like a kitten. He told her that he wasn't sure about the others, but the cats and dogs were loyal to a fault. After that, he left her to think on it and didn't mention the matter again. It was time to get down to business. They discussed dozens of locations, and she pulled out the floor plans for all of the ones that he decided were even remotely possible. Aline could tell that this was going to be a major sale, and she wasn't sure how the Duke would react to the sudden purchase of so much real estate. After much deliberation, the final selection was settled on. It turns out that at one point, small anterooms on the side of a building were a popular design, but most people favored buildings that made the most of all of the available space of that particular property. The L-shaped buildings were mostly passed over in favor of other designs, and that left a lot of them on the market. They just so happened to perfectly suit Ruji's ideal design for his intended bathhouses. He also didn't skimp on them. He intended to proposition Teresa on the possibility of adding a bath to her establishment, but that didn't mean he wouldn't be adding them all over the place also. In the end, Ruji found 6 locations that he considered ideal for his bathhouse plans. Then he had to add one more building for his soap and perfume manufactory. He was jumping to conclusions, but whatever. Even if the woman in the stall turned his offer down, he would still need to make soap. He also found 3 other properties that he decided to buy and decide what to do with them later. Something about the unsuitability of these buildings to be shown to most customers, and after a confirmation of their current condition that they would be discounted. Ruji decided that he would figure out what to put in them after they were renovated. Aline had a major look of calculation when she proposed that one to him, and he knew what she was up to. He could see the coins dancing in her eyes by this point, but why disappoint when he was likely to buy them anyway? Aline did get a bit of a surprise when Ruji wasn't able to pull the full amount out all at once. He had most of it but was a couple gold short. That was before considering the 3 soon-to-be discounted buildings. Ruji suggested that she take one of the beast folk children with her, and if the girl, since there were 2 older girls, could point out the vermin in the walls, pay the kid. He then suggested that, if she was going to do the survey of the 3 buildings soon, he could just wait for a total price including what he owed currently. Aline was a tad skeptical, but he told her he could go get the money right now if she needed it, but he would be a little longer coming back to check on the other 3 buildings. She saw through his supposed threat but told him she could wait anyway. In the end, it was decided that she would take one of the kids, if the parents agreed, and they would survey the buildings. He would bring the girl to her tomorrow if they agreed, and he would have all of the paperwork waiting on him in an 8-day, at which point he would have the full amount ready. After concluding his business at the tax office, Ruji headed for the inn. He didn't spot Karen or Teresa, but it wasn't a peak hour, so he supposed that they were likely either cleaning or taking care of some other business. That suited him fine. He headed to his room and pulled everything back out of his large satchel. He then began pulling coinage out of his coin pouch. He was only mildly surprised to find 3 large copper coins at a time appearing in his coin pouch. This time, rather than filling it completely to the top, Ruji left a bit of space and put his writing journal and utensils back in the bag. He then closed and locked the door and headed out of the inn. It didn't take him very long to reach his destination, the market plaza. Ruji went to each of the stands that he had business arrangements with. At each stand, he wrote the name of the owner and the type of product at the top of a fresh ledger page and then told them he wanted to get a count of their coins currently. At each, he would count up the total number of coins and would trade in a tad bit of small copper and would trade out any of the largest denominations in favor of large copper that he had so much of. He also took a tiny bit from each to avoid suspicion before saying he would be back in an 8-day. When he went to see Shone at the money changers, he was surprised to see him already busy. In order to avoid suspicion, he decided to wait for the teen to finish with his current customer. There were those that looked at him and then to Shone with envy. He supposed he would try to spread his business around a bit some other time. He really did prefer to use the same clerk at the stores he used to visit, now that he thought about it. It didn't take the boy long to finish. Once Ruji thought about it, this guy was probably about his age from his past life. Shone smiled broadly when he saw Ruji sit in front of him. He was prepared when he sat the large satchel on his desk and ran to the back while throwing a cursory question over his shoulder. "Shopping mix, right? Be right out." Ruji left him a small silver when he left. Ruji decided it was time to be getting to the plaza of his general store. He intended to pick up the cat beast folk husbands, and maybe even the whole family. He would get weapons for the men at the very least. If his plans panned out, he would get some kind of weapon for each of them. He remembered how worried he had been that the cat women would be killed by the murderous former owner of the general store before he caught the guy. Miyako was on her way to the market plaza in front of the magic shop when she saw a familiar face. It was the sun elf that she wanted to talk to. She went dashing after him, but lost sight of him in the milling crowd. She looked around a bit further along and spotted him next to the river. By the time she made it over to the river, he was a good ways ahead of her. She tried to catch up, but the guards were changing and she had to wait for them to move before she could get by. She finally caught sight of him as she was running along the bank or the river. She saw him turn the corner ahead of her like he was going to the general store, and she was sure she could catch him now. When she turned the corner, he was gone. She went to the general store, but he wasn't there, and the only building close was this old tenement and that abandoned building. She checked the tenement as best she could, but it was futile. He had vanished like a ghost. Ruji walked deeper into the old building where the cats lived and could hear them busy working on their crafts. The women and the older two girls were there sewing pouches and preparing leather. Ruji couldn't see the rest of them and he got a bit closer while shuffling his feet so he wouldn't scare anyone. The girl was the first to spot him and she shrieked, despite his effort to be noticed early. The other children and the two men came running into the room and Ruji could see the children at least were still holding broken wood. It seems the ones not needed for sewing were trying to clean the place up a bit. Ruji waved at them all sheepishly. Sorry, I was trying to make some noise so you would notice me and not get scared. I actually came by to see if you were all available for a couple hours. I want to get all of you something to defend yourselves if the need for it should arise. I won't force you, but I will insist on the guys at least having something or there would be no reason for them to be guards. Ruji was accustomed to the cats trying to keep him from spending money on them, so he was insistent from the start and it seemed to work. The cats all followed him to the smithy that Karen had taken him to before. It was rather hard to remember where it was, but he was able to ask people for directions. A lot of people knew of Brogan Hammerhand, anybody except the cats apparently. Once he found somebody who could read maps, Ruji had them list the smithy and the clothiers on the map. This person even knew of the armor shop he had visited and marked it on the map. Ruji thanked the young woman before going on his way, with the gaggle of cat beast folk following closely behind him. He hadn't really considered it until this point, but there did seem to be a slight disparity in the male to female population. It wasn't so skewed that it was glaringly obvious the first moment that he set foot in the city, but it was there. He estimated the populace to be roughly 3-2 in favor of females. He was puzzled by this at first and all the more so, because it didn't seem to be restricted to one race. After a bit, Ruji remembered that they had been in a war for nearly a century. Who ships off to war? Strong young men, mostly. There were a lot of elderly and women, but not a lot of men. His musings were cut short as he reached the shop of Brogan, the weaponsmith. When he stepped inside, the two apprentices of the master smith spotted him and rushed over to thank him for a last time. When he had been there last, he had bought a Damascus blade made by Brogan and a fancy dagger made by the shorter of the two apprentices. He had paid way too much for the items so the apprentices would get a bonus. Brogan came around the end of a rack after hearing the commotion and was a tad surprised to see Ruji back. When he spotted the group of cat beast folk hovering near him, his eyes narrowed and he nodded questioningly at them. Good day, Brogan, and his worthy apprentices. I've come with a challenge and good coin. I need equipment for them, all of them. Brogan looked at them and then at Ruji, and his eyes narrowed. Ta what end? Ya not be a planning ta have the lot of them fightin' fair ya? I dinny be a thinkin' they be up ta that. Ruji looked at the dwarf and then at the cats and then back to Brogan. Why ever not? Look at the little one, trained killer that one. Oh, the adults will kill you soon as look at you, but the little ones are the ones you gotta worry about. The dwarf got that disconcerting grin that made his face look like it ended at his lower lip. Brogan, my good dwarf, it's so they can defend themselves. I've hired the lot of them and want to arm them against thieves or drunks. Oh, and the men are going to be guards so they would need appropriate equipment. I was thinking a sword and spear combo for them and short swords or daggers for the rest. Brogan waved them all in with a hearty laugh. Aye, they do look the part now that ye be mentionin' it. So, how's the sword practice goin', eh? Ruji got a guilty look on his face. In all the confusion lately, I haven't practiced at all. I also don't have a blunted practice sword. Shouldn't those be a little heavier than the sword you intend to use? Anyway, I also don't even know how to use the sword, much less practice moves or forms or whatever. Oh, and before I forget, do you have something to keep the rust off of them? I kind of let mine get a little rusty, so now I need to know how to take care of it. Remember, I don't know anything about weapons really. Brogan just sighed and waved him over. He cleaned the sword and knife and then handed him a cleaning kit. Ruji asked for a few more for the cats. He then handed Ruji a book on sword fighting technique and training, and Ruji pulled a second copy off the shelf. Then he got to work with the cats. Brogan found the right length of decent steel swords for both of the men. The apprentices took the women and children around to pick their weapons, while Brogan found a pair of halberds at a decent price. The catwomen surprised Ruji when they came back carrying full-sized weapons. Marlize had picked a rather intimidating single-sided war axe, while her sister, Krissa, had opted for a multi-flanged light mace. The children, all four, seemed to be carrying swords of varying lengths and styles. Ruji could tell from the gaudy style that the swords were all made by the boys. The other two weapons, Ruji was fairly certain Brogan had made those. Brogan, Ruji, and their husbands were impressed with the women's choices. Brogan grinned at Ruji and cracked a joke. "Now I be wonderin' if'n ye werena be tellin' the truth aboot the lot of 'em. I be fearin' fair me own safety at the vera least, lookin' at that lot o' little devils." The women looked very proud of their children and of the weapons. Ruji asked about the heavy blunted weapons and was shown to that section where he even found practice axes, maces, and spears. He asked the family to pick out a weapon for the old cat, Gatto, and was amazed to find out that the old man actually had a sword already. He was then told that it was pretty rusty, and Ruji looked at Brogan, who told them to bring it by. When Brogan began to tally all of the items up, Ruji cut him off. He pulled out 2 large gold and laid them down on the counter and asked if that would be enough or if he needed more. Brogan got his grin back before replying that yeah, that would be enough. The group left bristling with weapons, and more than one passerby wondered if they were all about to go to the warfront. The next stop was the clothier's shop, and the fussy little gnome and his family genuinely loved the idea of matching uniforms. Ruji ordered 2 uniforms for each of them. The cut was simple and durable, and the color was a very inexpensive but eye-catching orange for the top and tan for the pants and shoes. As a reward for not complaining about how much he spent on them, he took the women to the dress shop and got all the girls a dress. The guys were allowed to pick 1 set of clothes from the Brant's tailor shop. Ruji spent another 2 large gold but considered it well worth it. Ruji took them to the armor shop and got the men a leather breastplate in an orange color. It was important for them to look the part. They all made one last stop at the meat skewer vendor. Ruji had downed 6 skewers before he realized it, but the cats were thankfully too preoccupied with their own skewers to notice. He wondered about his momentary loss of control. Finally, Ruji said goodbye to the cats in front of the storefront. Gatto came out and was very surprised to see his family looking like a band of outlaws. Ruji told the cats that he would be by some evenings to help them learn to read. The men, he told that he would be by to train with them. To Gatto, he relayed Brogan's message about his sword, and the old cat began to cry. Ruji left quickly. When Ruji got back to the inn with the practice sword, cleaning kit, and the book on sword training, Karen got a knowing grin on her face. That night, they had a lot to talk about. Ruji also talked to Teresa about adding a bathhouse to the inn, and he thought that she might propose to him at any second. He was all set, now he just had to figure out how to actually make one. Ruji wakes up and goes about his morning routine every day. He has his bread of one type or another with Karen each morning and usually eats a more fulfilling breakfast a bit later with his master, Dorn. He learns at an incredible pace. It's not a matter of him having some unnatural ability, it's just his upbringing and the ideas he has learned in Japan before coming to this world making themselves useful. Ruji figures out that the days are actually a bit shorter than Earth's days, and that's one reason he's having so much trouble finding time to do everything. He tells Dorn he needs to start leaving a little earlier each day so that he can do sword training with the cat beast folk family, and at first Dorn is against it. He says that a wizard has no business on the front lines with a sword, but relents when Ruji explains to him that he also needs to teach them to read and write. Dorn is still a bit apprehensive, but when he sees Ruji interacting with the catgirls, he relents. He reminds himself how advanced his pupil is anyway and realizes that there isn't any need to push him to keep a tight schedule of training because he picks it all up so quickly, much quicker than a normal student would. Ruji spends most of his time teaching the cats to read and actually has very little time to do much practice. He reads the book on sword training and finds that most of it is mindless repetition of swings and thrusts. He does practice a little with the cat family, especially the younger ones. The catmen very quickly begin to master the techniques in the book, and their swordsmanship improves far too rapidly for Ruji to keep up with. The heavy swords and better diet leave them with corded muscles and looking very intimidating, much to the appreciation of their wives. The women and children all train with their weapons as well, and in only a few days' time, the rest of the people working in the general store start seeing them as their protectors. The catmen don't mind and take to patrolling the whole block with their spears and swords. They take turns while the other help direct the work crews in the remodeling of the storefront. The storefront makes steady progress, with the old and rotten portions having to be torn down and removed first. The cats become a little apprehensive when Ruji tells them that he wants to upgrade the building to a 3-story one. They are worried that he's going to make them the center of attention for a huge store of some kind. He lays their worries to rest and tells them that he's going to make the entire 2nd and 3rd story into a set of apartments for them and the other workers. Since this was his decision, he pays the work crew the extra amount to do the larger project without complaint, and the cats wonder what kind of workforce needs 2 stories of apartments. The renovations to the other buildings of the general store plaza take a bit longer to arrange since most of the workers in town are working on his other projects already. Baran gets worried about his inability to snag many workers, but Ruji tells him not to sweat it because he knows a few crews that are about to be free. In a very short span of time, the bakery becomes fully restored, and as the work crews become free, Ruji hires them directly with Aline's blessing. He got the fervent approval of the brother of the woman selling perfume in the plaza, and they look at the building he purchased for the manufactory and are stunned speechless for a while as Ruji goes on and on about the ways he wants to set up a production line. The idea isn't unknown in their world, but the idea that it could be so compact and efficient was amazing to the pair. They timidly ask and are granted immediate permission to move into the building after some minor renovation and repairs are finished. Ruji also made another arrangement with Lisbeth and her 2 daughters. He began buying all the rest of their bread at the end of each day and having them deliver the bread to the orphanages and the slums. He had an idea to get a soup kitchen started, but the bread was more readily available for the time. The goodwill garnered from this and the fact that he had the cats go and help with distribution several times meant that as soon as the bakery was ready to open, the women already had people lined out to take over sales from their stands and had licenses for new stands in plazas that didn't have them. With all the regular bread available elsewhere, the bakery needed a reason to keep clientele coming back to them. Ruji had a huge number of ideas for new, to the people of the town, types of bread products. The lightly salted bagel chips became wildly popular, and the store sold out of them each day well before lunch. Ruji was happy that his businesses were doing well. Not everyone was happy that he was doing so well. There were a couple of groups that were looking for the chance to have a chat with him and convince him that he should either hand over all his assets or at the very least cut them in for the lion's share of the profits. There was a problem with their plans. He began at this time to spend a bit of time working with the town watch to get the swimming lesson program up and running. He first made sure that all of the guards knew how to swim as well as they were claiming. It seems that some were only interested in the extra coin and were thinking that they could take the payment and then tell the peasant brats to scram or worse to throw them into the river and tell them to just swim. These fellows found that they were going to have to provide the lessons and that there would often be a noble watching over their shoulder and were less than happy about it. Not everything was going great for Ruji though. There was a problem that he was beginning to realize was growing more urgent each day. His craving for meat was growing rapidly. He had another episode of changing into a wolf beast folk and had to buy a round dozen skewers to sate his hunger enough to transform back. It had gotten so bad that the cat beast folk caught him eating the skewers at one point. The parents were silent about it, but once again the children had no filter. The kids confronted him about it on the way back to the leatherworks. They were just curious. Because they had heard all their lives that sun elves didn't eat meat. While the adults were apologetic about the children being nosy, they too seemed entirely too interested. He came up with a plausible lie rather quickly. He asked if the other elves had the same reputation and found that the rarely seen wood elves did, but the dark elves didn't. He reasoned that it had to be that he had mixed blood and said that it had been bothering him a little too. When he asked them to keep it a secret, they all readily agreed. That only solved one small part of the problem. Ruji knew what the problem was, without anyone needing to spell it out for him. He was becoming more of a werewolf and he was losing control. He was so worried about it that he even began to try to distance himself from Karen. He was worried that he might transform and harm her, or at the least that she would realize and turn him in. He had to turn down a couple dates. He really wanted to go on them, but he was worried about the way the last one had gone and maybe having a repeat. Ruji was afraid that if he let their relationship advance, that she would try to spend more time with him, and she would have too. Karen began to make more advances toward him. She was hoping that she would be able to take their relationship to the next level, but was worried that maybe he didn't like her as much anymore. Ruji could tell that his refusals were affecting her, and he had to come up with a reasonable response sooner rather than later. One morning when Karen began clinging to him and he was acting distant, she decided that it was time. If he wanted to end things, she wasn't going to get in his way. She knew that she had gotten a bit too attached to the elf lord, and he was in truth beyond her station. She asked him if he wanted to go on a date, and when he hedged around the subject, she asked him why he was avoiding her. Ruji was being put on the spot and he needed an excuse quick. He adored Karen and very much did not want to lose her, but he didn't want to put her at risk either. He was really hoping that if he could keep her at a safe distance, he would be able to figure this out and then get closer to her. That was the plan anyway, but now she was pushing the issue and he found he couldn't blame her. He needed to say something, but what? Ruji was being put on the spot by Karen. He couldn't avoid her advances anymore without giving her some kind of reason, so he said the first thing that came to mind to keep Karen, and to a lesser degree Teresa, placated. He told them that his studies with the old wizard Doran were getting harder and he was having a hard time finding enough time to keep up with all his businesses and do his studies. This got him rather incredulous looks from both women. Karen took it for a blatant lie, since she had grown up hearing about the old dwarf refusing apprentices since he first moved to town when she was very young. She said that if he didn't want to tell her, that was fine, and stormed off to her room. Teresa confronted him after and told him that he didn't need to lie to Karen like that, because she could tell he liked her a lot, but love couldn't live through too many lies. He then told her that it wasn't a lie and began drawing a magic circle in the air using some water from a cup abandoned on a nearby table. She was a little surprised that he knew magic, but told him that him having magic didn't change the fact that his story was preposterous. As she was walking back into the kitchen, she threw over her shoulder that everybody knew that old Doran wouldn't take any apprentices, so he needed to go tell Karen the truth. He was left standing there wishing that he could. During his studies during the morning, he lost focus easily because his mind kept wandering back to his fight with Karen. He was to the point that he was already practicing full first-level spells. At a point near noon, he almost miswrote the central glyph of an earth spell meant to fling a small clod of rock at a target. The spell was winding up to go out of control when Doran snapped at him to finish it quick. He made it in time for the spell to shoot at the target harmlessly, but Doran got mad at him for the lapses of attention. Doran told him to take lunch early and go clear his head before he came back. Ruji intended to spend lunch with the cats since he was off early. He also began thinking that perhaps he should look at the market and find a present for Karen too. He began considering what to get for Karen that would make up for the argument that morning. He was thinking of things she might like and wanted to find something good for her because he was worried about losing her. He found himself getting distracted by a smell again and was really frustrated about it. He was really worried about what to get Karen, and there his mind was trying to wander off to sniff out some damn meat skewers. He got so worked up about it that he slammed his fist against the wall of the alley he was in. Then he looked at his fist and found it to be gray and furry and rolled his eyes thinking, great, that's just what I needed right now, to have to deal with more werewolf BS. He tried to focus again, and this time, realizing what the problem was, he was able to direct his thoughts around it. He began to suspect that he might just need to do something to prove his story about being the wizard's apprentice. He still really wanted to get Karen something to apologize for distancing himself from her, so he set off again, but a sparkle on the ground grabbed his attention. He looked down at the floor of the alleyway but couldn't make anything out. He then realized he had no way of looking either, because it was too dark under the overhang of the building, especially since it was an overcast day. He thought for a second and realized that he could look if he could form a firelight. He started to dismiss the idea because he had no reagents of any kind to dip his finger into in order to draw the spell. Then it hit him, there were reagents for fire in the air around him. Ruji decided that he would give that a try. First, he concentrated on just 2 elements. He only needed the hydrogen and the oxygen around him to be caught by his magic. He gathered his thoughts and concentrated on feeling his magic, and eventually he was able to visualize it. He then concentrated on only grabbing those 2 gases out of the air with his magic, forbidding it to attach to anything else. When he opened his eyes, he saw that the tip of his finger looked hazy and hoped that was because of the gases he was after. He then began pushing his mana through it and focused on only using those 2 gases. He was gratified when he found a glowing blue trail in the air, following his fingertip in a circle. He was worried that might be the color of air magic, but it didn't seem quite right for that. He had drawn a few air spells, but not many. Dorn considered air magic to be mostly useless, but relatively harmless to practice with early on. Since Ruji was such a quick study, Dorn didn't linger on air long and moved on to what he considered useful spells. The circle completed, Ruji moved on to the geometric. For a simple firelight spell that could be used to light fires with off the end of a finger, he only needed a simple triangle. He then wrote the all-important center focus glyph, the one for fire. He wrote in the focus point glyphs outside the circle at each point, being careful to adjust the one for the component to be gas, not coal, and he wasn't sure if that part would work. He then wrote the quick lines of glyphs on the outside edges of the triangle. He didn't need many, because the spell wasn't very complex. With the last of the few glyphs he wrote on the triangle, the spell circle was complete and he could begin pushing in a bit of his mana. This was the very first spell he had ever seen demonstrated aside from the enchantment on the stove at Dorn's shop. There were a couple differences concerning the glyphs used since he was trying to work with hydrogen and oxygen. He just hoped it would work. Ruji then pushed a bit of his mana through the glyph in the center and he was gratified to see the whole circle, which only measured about 60 centimeters across, flared with dazzling blue-white flames before winking out. Instantly Ruji was left with a similarly bright blue-white flame hovering above his fingertip. It was very obvious that it was using the gases in the air to burn that bright. Ruji was so mesmerized by the flame that he momentarily forgot about the item on the ground he wanted to look at. He also missed the startled exit of the man who had come into the alley, thinking to score a quick bit of coin from the elf who had come into the alley. The old drunk was so terrified by what he saw that he swore he would stop drinking. He had thought he was following an elf, and then, in an eye-searing flash of what just had to be magic, it was revealed that he was actually following a beast folk. The guy still had a nice coin purse and a satchel, but in the sudden brilliant light, the thief could now clearly see the sword and dagger at the guy's hip. Worse, the guy didn't have any spell stuff on him and somehow still drew a magic circle in front of him where the would-be thief couldn't see it. He also made what had to be a rather high-level fire spell in almost no time. The thief took the obvious hint and beat a hasty retreat. If anybody could be a wizard and not even have to have all that spell stuff on them, how was a man to make a dishonest living? He couldn't, that's how. Finally, remembering why he had cast the spell, Ruji moved his hand with the bright light down to the ground and discovered a small scale of some kind. As he looked at it in the bright light, he noted its features. The scale was lustrous if a little drab in color. It was a medium brown, but looked like it was made of a gemstone. It was blunt and rounded at the bottom edge, but the other end was sharp and tipped with a wicked point. He noted that the sharp edge was actually serrated and the whole thing was almost half the size of his hand. The inside and outside edges were clear, since it was slightly concave. On the back, it had a bit of grime growing on it. Apparently, it had been sitting there for some time since it had moss or something growing on it. Ruji put it against the wall and rubbed it back and forth to clean the backside off. Imagine his surprise when the edge of the scale tipped into the stone and began leaving grooves where the serrations met it. On a whim, Ruji shoved the tip against the stone expecting the tip to snap off, and was startled yet again when the tip buried itself into the stone instead. Ruji had to work the scale back and forth to dislodge it, but he had to be careful not to let it slip lest it cut his hand open. It came away with a bit of the stone stuck to it. Ruji checked, and the stone wasn't soft or brittle, the scale was just that hard. It was now a little cleaner, but still dirty. Ruji didn't mind. He took out a linen he had with him and sat the soap inside the scale before wrapping them both carefully in the rag and setting his new prize inside his satchel. Ruji looked to his hand and marveled once again at the fire spell he had cast with no components save those he was breathing. He closed his hand over his fingertips, and the bright flame went out as if someone had cut its supply of gas to burn. As he picked his way carefully out of the alleyway, still somewhat blinded by the brightness of the flame, he wondered if Dorn knew this was possible. Ruji doubted that the old dwarf could recreate this spell because he probably didn't know about the existence of oxygen, much less hydrogen. Upon exiting the alleyway, his senses were once again accosted by the smell, but it was so strong that he couldn't fight it. The smell was close, in fact, it was coming closer. Ruji looked around and there were only a few people in the little pavilion formed by the surrounding buildings. He quickly spotted the one who had the tantalizing aroma coming from her. Coming out of another alleyway to his left was a cat beast folk, not one he knew though. This one was a little tall for her kind, almost coming to eye level with Ruji himself. Her fur was orange shot through, with strips of black and white framing a pouty teenage face. Her eyes were also yellow-orange and slit-pupilled. Those eyes locked onto him and she saw his gaze on her and stopped. Ruji was too mesmerized by the smell to pay a lot of attention to the very pretty young cat girl. He walked towards her with purpose in his steps. He was a little confused because he couldn't see any sign of meat skewers in her hands or on her person. She did have a backpack on though, and now that he got a bit closer he could tell that's where the scent was emanating from, but it wasn't skewers, it smelled even better. The girl backed up a couple steps from him and he regained a bit of focus. He realized he must look pretty craven right now and wiped the drool from his mouth. And righted his shirt before looking her in the eye and speaking with a smile. "I do believe you have a pack with meat in it. Would you be amenable to selling me a portion of it?" The girl looked at the pack over her shoulder and then back at the guy in front of her. She noticed that there were no longer any people in the area, so if she said no and things got violent, she wouldn't have any witnesses about what happened. Something about the way he spoke made him sound somehow very sophisticated. That was in stark contrast to his appearance. Oh, his clothes were fine but seemed a bit tight on him as though they were made for somebody without such a broad chest. And suddenly, she found herself almost drooling. She shook herself mentally. This guy smelled like trouble, literally. He smelled like he was feral. Did he have no clue about the pheromones he was putting off? If she were a wolf girl, she doubted she would be able to resist jumping right into his arms and demanding a litter of pups. He might have been conscious of it actually. She could detect traces of a cologne, but it wasn't doing the trick against the amount of pheromones he was pouring out. She reminded herself that she needed to answer him and looked him in the eye. "Sorry man, I got a contract to sell this to a stand in town. The guy buys everything I get and he's always on the lookout for more. I'll get a good bit of coin for this meat." The slightly scruffy and feral-looking wolf beast folk seemed to consider her words very carefully. Either he was very calculating despite his looks, or he was good with words but slow and had to form replies carefully. She somehow suspected the first to be the case. "You said you have a contract to sell everything, but you never said that the owner of the stand was expecting you to deliver a set quantity." "Quite the contrary, your words suggest that he buys from you in bulk and is glad of whatever he can get at a time. Then there is the matter of payment." Her mouth twitched into a smirk. This guy was sharp as her claws. Then he made to reach into his fancy coin purse. It was one of 3, and hidden behind his sword. What he drew out seemed to shock him almost as much as it did her. Ruji reasoned with the cat girl and was about to offer her a large copper. When he stuck his fingers into his pouch, he was expecting to feel 4 large copper, but he didn't find them. Instead, his fingers fished around until they came across 1 small coin, and he drew the single small silver out in amazement. When had he leveled up? Realization hit him with a growl of his stomach that he hoped wasn't audible to the cat girl. When he looked at her, his hopes were dashed. She wore a grin that said she had heard his stomach quite clearly. He reminded himself it didn't matter right now. Will your client buy each portion for a silver? The look on her face said, not a chance. I don't want to cheat your client, but I'm perfectly willing to buy a portion of your haul for a silver. She didn't hesitate and began pulling her pack off that instant. Sold, was all she said to him. Her pack was a heavy canvas, with a generous application of wax on the inside. All her equipment was stored in the pouches on the back and sides of it, including her Teko Kagi, iron claws, and all of her various daggers. The main pouch was full to the top with leaf-wrapped bundles of raw venison. As she watched him shred and rend the cut, wolfing it down, quite literally, something clicked in her mind. Here was a guy who didn't care what the humans, the elves, and the dwarves thought of him. He was his own man and would eat his raw meat in public whether they liked it or not. Not only that, he was tall, smelled wonderful, had broad shoulders, talked eloquently, and was very quick, both mentally and physically. The only problem was that he was a wolf. Then she thought about it and wondered, is that a problem? Did she want children right now? No, she certainly did not. There was a tiny chance that 2 cross-species beast folk could sire children, but the chances were tiny. Suddenly, she got a gleam in her eyes and just watched him, enraptured. Well, you certainly seem to be enjoying that. My name's Kurako. And you are? Ruji had just finished the second bundle of meat, a very nice bonus, and was licking his mouth and fingers. He was a little weirded out by how long and flexible his tongue was now, but that had nothing on the flavor. Suddenly the cat girl spoke to him and he was drawn back to reality and away from the mind-altering flavor of the meat. Kurako, eh? An interesting name, and she asked for his. Suddenly, the look that she had given him when she saw him eating came back to him and he realized that there was something wrong there. Also, unless he was misreading something in her expression, hard to tell with the whiskers and whatnot, she was sizing him up the way Karen had. Ruji decided it was time for a tactical retreat, but he needed to be polite. He might need to buy more meat from her at some point, after all. My name is Ruji. It's a pleasure to make your acquaintance, Madame Kurako. If you will excuse me, I have to be on my way now, but the meat was excellent. He then considered his hand and didn't want to take her hand with his, or else he might kiss it. No, he had Karen to think about. He settled for a bow, before leaving the alley in a rush. Realizing that her dashing prince was literally dashing away, Kurako quickly retied her pack and shouldered it. By the time she made it to the end of the alleyway, he was nowhere in sight. Little did she realize that he had ducked into the alley next street up. She turned his name over and over in her mind and then thought about it logically. He was probably taken. But what if he wasn't? Also, he had a sword on his hip. There was a chance she might be able to convince him to join the Mercenaries Guild and party with her. She made her mind up to ask him to do that next time she spotted him. Kurako was picking her way through the Great Shadow Wood, the forest south of the city. This day, like most others, she was out hunting on a guild assignment. She had been a hunter for a decent portion of her life, but now that she had joined the Mercenaries Guild, she got paid to do it. Her mother was the one who had taught her how, but then she disappeared one day when Kia was 8. Her grandmother took her in after that. Her father had died of a disease before she was born. After her father died, her mother went through several boyfriends, and they all left after a few months. As a child she had thought that her mother was being selfish, but when she got older, she realized that her mother had been lonely, but more than that. She was trying to find a father for her daughter. It was a good thing that her mother had taught her how to hunt because the last boyfriend had actually left her a gift, and a year later Kia had a new baby sister. It was rather hard for her mother to go out hunting when she was pregnant, much less when she had an infant. Kia's grandmother had a job cleaning in a house and was busy most of the time making the money that they used to pay rent. When she was able, she would watch little Mancuso, but the rest of the time her mother took care of her daughter. Kia finally convinced her mother that she could watch her sister when she was 7. It had taken her 2 years. She never would have tried if she knew her mother would disappear a year later while out hunting. Kia used to cry at night begging her mother to come back, but she knew, somewhere deep down, she knew that her mother was never going to come back from the dead. Kia only had a short time that she could go out and hunt while her grandmother was home from work. She got really good at making her time count. Then one day, the unthinkable happened. The lady of the house her grandmother worked at said that she had stolen jewelry. It was preposterous. They would have been able to eat much better if they had money from stolen jewelry, and the town watch said as much. Her grandmother was free to go, and the woman was accused by her husband of faking the whole thing to get more jewelry. Everything was good except that the family didn't hire her grandmother back. How could they if they wanted to save face? With her grandmother home, Kurako was able to hunt much easier, but there was a problem: they were almost out of money. How could she help her family? The only thing she knew how to do was hunt or take care of her sister. Oh, she could do a few chores, but not like her grandmother could. Then she found out that the Mercenaries Guild hired people for hunting. She used daggers, which were a lot cheaper than most weapons if she were to lose one. She qualified right away and started making money to keep the household under a roof, and her grandmother took over taking care of her sister. At first, the hunting was fun, but then it became boring since it was always the same requests: deer, rabbits, and once in a while a wild sow. She always enjoyed the hunting for wild hogs because it was challenging. Also, when she would fell a sow, a boar would almost always come after her. The meat wasn't as good, but that was okay with her and her family. The people in town didn't want boar meat, only the sows, so she took those all for herself. There were other things to hunt in the forest, but the townspeople wouldn't eat those, and certainly wouldn't pay for them. That day she was out on a quest for a deer and several rabbits. So boring, always the same. All she had to do was listen and follow her nose right to them. Speaking of, she had just picked up the scent of a rabbit warren on the wind. She began following her nose to it. Draven and his buddies were out on a mission to hunt. It wasn't that big of a deal, just some rabbits and a deer. Jux had just told them he had seen a rabbit in the underbrush near them, so they all tensed up. They each had a sturdy branch to use as a club, and Gran was going to be the spook to send them to the rest of the party. There were 2 more people in the party. There was Ferris and there was Red. Everybody was human in Draven's party. He just didn't really like other races, so since he was party leader, he only accepted humans. They were just getting ready to spook the rabbits out and start the hunt when a cat beast folk girl in her mid to late teens wandered up sniffing the air. Draven was cursing her timing under his breath. If he weren't worried about spooking the rabbits, he would have told her to get lost. Before Gran could make his way around to the bush, the cat girl jumped right into the middle of it. When she dove in, Draven jumped up and would have started cursing if he weren't so livid. He watched as about 8 rabbits bolted from the bush and was just about to order his guys to go try to club any they could before they all escaped when a flash caught his attention. At first, he didn't know what he was seeing, but then when he realized, he was speechless for a different reason. 6 daggers flashed out of the bush at barely above the ground, and each one connected with a rabbit in midbound. The hapless bunnies were all left slightly maimed, with only one shot connecting in an instant fatality. The cat girl didn't seem to notice them, and that was probably because they were downwind. She jumped back out of the bush and the 5 squealing rabbits were dispatched within seconds. She approached each, snapping the neck and bleeding them with a hanging cord in a rhythm and at a pace that said that she had done this same routine dozens if not hundreds of times. She then spent a minute cleaning her daggers and waiting for the rodents to lose most of their vital fluid. The moment she was done storing the last dagger on her chest bandolier, she pulled out a piece of waxed leather with a belt on it and put it on her left leg. She then took down the 6 rabbits and hung them on her belt. The bit of blood that was left in any of them slid off the ankle-length garment as though it had never touched it at all. Then the mysterious catgirl ran off at a leisurely pace. Hirako finished the rabbit portion of her quest and was bored more than tired, so she decided to take a nap. It was the work of seconds to scale an old oak tree with a huge overhanging branch, just perfect for dozing off on. She had already stopped by the stream where she cleaned and packed the rabbits. The stream wasn't very cold during the hottest part of the day, but every little bit of coolness helped. The dry brussels leaves wrapped inside the huge vaso leaves with the meat would help to partially cure it before she even took it to the meat stand. It was a couple hours later, and the 5 guys in Draven's party were looking for a deer. They had set the rabbit part of it aside for now. They had managed to find another bush that had some rabbits, but only managed to club 4 of them. The smell of the rabbit carcasses was going to be a big deterrent to any of the small game, and the pile of innards was likely to draw scavengers or even predators. At least with the deer, it was big enough to hunt with a bow, so they wouldn't need to worry about the smell of blood on them and could stay well downwind of the deer. And put an arrow through it before it knew they were there. Speaking of a deer, there was a doe in front of them, and he stopped his party with a low hand signal. He felt the wind change just as he was lining up the shot on his bow. The deer, which was a little on the small side but acceptable, seemed to smell them, or maybe it heard them. Whichever the case was, the deer flicked its ears a couple times and turned around, and started walking cautiously away. It didn't get more than 100 paces when a flash dropped out of the tree right on top of it. The doe didn't have time to even flinch and it dropped. The same catgirl from earlier stood slowly drawing her strange claw-like weapons from the back of the deer's neck. She was perfectly straddling the deer as she drew the weapons free of it, and its head simply drooped limply to the ground. Draven was speechless. The deer was dead before it even hit the ground, and she had spent almost no energy to fell it, unlike his group who were fumbling around and walking for over a candle's pan looking for one. Hirako was wiping her claws of blood lest they end up keeping the scent. The doe was a little light but not too underweight. Suddenly, her nose was twitching and she could smell blood that wasn't from the deer. Then she heard the noise and looked in that direction. There were 5 men with bows standing there, and in an instant, she knew they had been after this same deer. One of them drew near and he was talking about how they had been walking around for a candle's pan looking for a deer, and she just dropped on it out of nowhere. She didn't want to hear any more. She looked away and took off running to a chorus of shouts like, "Wait!" Why would she wait around for them to accuse her of poaching their kill? Hirako was so sick of living by the rules of the civilized races. If only she had more courage, she would have told them to find their own kill. If only she had the courage to live her own way, but for now, it was time to go find a new spot to ambush a deer. Ryuji was freaking out a little bit. First, he had just walked up to a strange cat beast folk girl and asked her to sell him some meat. Second, the meat he had just eaten and enjoyed enormously was raw. He had eaten it raw. Third, he was pretty sure he had just charmed or hit on that girl without even trying. Who does that? Fourth, he had tried to escape into a crowd when he was about to transform back into an elf. His reasoning was absolute crap when he was in that state. Ryuji decided he needed to find out more about werewolves and not wait either. He needed to do so immediately. He supposed that there must be a library in the city, probably in the nobles' district. He was also fairly certain that if werewolves were a problem, there was information on them in that library, and he needed to find it yesterday, no 8 days ago. Wait, was he even using the local times in his own mind now? Was that good? Enough. He needed to go do what he had come here for and go back to talk to Karen. While he did like the cats, right now he decided that he needed to clear up the crap with Karen more. He decided that as soon as he was done finding Karen a present that he's going to go talk to Dorn and tell him he needs the next day off. Then he's going straight back to the inn and talk things over with Karen. He decides that he likes her enough that if she doesn't relent, he will tell her, but not before he tells her that if she tells anyone that he will have to leave, and that will harm a lot of people. No pressure there, that's not what people call a dick move or racking somebody with guilt. Gah, enough. Ruji checked himself and found that he was an elf again. That meant it was time to go find that present. Now, what to get? He had gotten her earrings before, but what about now? Ruji looked around at all the stalls, trying to get inspiration. There were all kinds of jewelry and assorted items, but nothing grabbed his attention. He thought about ordering her a new dress, but he didn't have her measurements. Besides, he had gotten her 3 dresses for their first date. He was drawing a blank and was just about to give up when he spotted it, just the thing. When he approached the stall, the guy at the stall started trying to butter him up immediately. His case wasn't helped by the fact that he was less than half Ruji's height, and unlike some of the other halflings he had thus far seen, this guy seemed to be more of a boy. He had no facial hair and his voice wasn't particularly deep, so he just seemed like a child. He certainly talked a good line though. He immediately started trying to offer Ruji a deal on a shield that he said would go perfectly with the sword he had. He was really talking it up, and if Ruji had shown even the slightest interest, it might have been enchanted before the conversation was over. He saw that his pitch wasn't working for the shield and went with the poncy-looking pair of bracers as his next item of choice. Ruji was getting annoyed, and he could tell. Ruji finally stopped him with his hand upheld before he spoke in a mild but no-nonsense tone of voice. I am only interested in 4 items here, and I would appreciate if you didn't bother with their entire history. I don't want to know what dynasty of ancient something or other people made them. I also don't want to know what the today-only sales special is. I just want the regular price for the items I point out. Think you can do that? I'll make it worth your while to just cut the crap. The halfling guy boy looked like he had been slapped, but agreed to the request. That is the Book of Deep Humor. It's an anthology of crude dwarven humor, and I'll take a small silver for it. That one is Princes to Priests. It's about history, and I'll take 6 large copper for it. That one there is Lustrous Pink. It's a book of poems, mostly for women. I'll take a silver for that one too. Oh, so that's where you were looking. You've got a good eye, sir. Right. It's made with the shell of some kind of creatures from the sea. I'll take 2 silver for that. Ruji paid the boy, yeah, he was never going to be able to shake that notion, for the merchandise and gave him a bit of extra. Oh sir, that would only be never mind. Let me tie that up with a cord to make it easier to carry. Come see me again. Ruji made a mental note to never do that. It was time to go back to potions and such and have a chat with Dorn and get tomorrow off. There was just one thing, should he stop and deal with the guys following him? His internalized question was answered when the men saw a member of the town watch who came right over and greeted Ruji. They suddenly needed to be elsewhere. Interesting. The guy from the watch was ecstatic. He had made over double his pay this 8-day because of the swimming lessons, and just wanted to thank Ruji for making that happen. Ruji arrived back at the shop a few minutes later, and Dorn was a tad surprised to see him. Laddie, I dinna mean fair ye ta be a comin' back today. Ye be a needin' a break, so get ye gone, aye. Ruji put the stack of books with the box down, and Dorn eyed it with suspicion. Dorn, I need tomorrow off as well. I need to go to the library if Lyril has one. I want to do some research on various magical creatures. You know, like werewolves and fairies and such. Also, do you know where the library is? If so, could I get you to mark it on my map? Dorn eyed him with a slight scowl, before answering with a measured tone as if he were suddenly unsure where he stood. The library, ye say? Mightn't I be a skin, just what part o' the royal family ye be belongin' ta? Ruji's eyes went wide at first, then narrowed. Dorn, are you saying that I would have to be royalty to enter the library? Is it that heavily restricted? Dorn suddenly looked a little calmer and more self-assured. Nah laddie, ye don't gotta be a royal ta be enterin' the library. Ye just gotta be one rich son of a dragon. It'll be a costing ye 6 silver ta be enterin', and I don't mean the small uns neither. 6 large silver, or my name's Tree River Forest Lover. Now do be tellin' me lad, ye got 6 large silver ta be spendin' on your research into these critters? Ruji looked at the old dwarf a little puzzled but answered truthfully. Dorn, I'm not hurting for money. I can easily spend 6 large silver if I'm fairly sure that I'll get something out of it. If it were gold, I'd probably hold off unless I could be absolutely sure that the info I wanted was there and more. What's that look about? Dorn looked absolutely livid. Laddie, dinna be a tellin' me ye could have been a buyin' your spell materials alla this time? Didn't it ever occur to ye to be a buyin' your stuff fair bein' a wizard? If'n ye got alla that much coin ta be a burnin' a hole in your purse, why don't ye be a sharin' that with me? Ruji suddenly looked sheepish as realization dawned on him. A wizard can be bought, even lessons could have been bought. Well, maybe not that. The old dwarf's words rang in his ears. No, he wouldn't have been able to buy his way into an apprenticeship, but everything else. I just thought I had to wait for you to tell me when I could get my stuff. I didn't want to buy everything before you thought I was ready for it. Dorn looked almost scandalized. Laddie, this be a business I be a runnin' here. I dinna charge ye because I dinna be thinkin' ye had the coin. If'n ye gots the coin ta part with, then I be a havin' the supplies fair ye. I wouldna be toyin' round with fire spells all unprepared like, but other end that ye generally canny be a doin' too much trouble if'n ye botch a spell. Most o' the time, if'n ye canny be a doin' the spell in time, it'll just be a goin' poof and ye lose your mana ye spent in the bit o' spell component ye was usin' ta cast with. That spell ye was a messin' this morn, it wouldna done much more and give ye a few bruises. I didna send ye off fair your safety. I didna want ye wastin' my time a playin' at spells if'n your heart wasna in it. Ye gotta focus if'n I'm gonna be a spendin' me time a teachin' ye. Aye? Now, how's about ye be a showin' me the color o' your coin? Ruji grinned and took out a large gold and tossed it to Dorn, who just about blew a fuse. I guess I'll go ahead and get a little of this and that. I have one condition though. If I'm going to be stocking up on all the books and implements I need, I want your help in carrying all of it to my room in the inn. I seem to have a problem with people believing that I got an apprenticeship. Besides, it kind of sounds like I need so much stuff that I will need a second set of hands to carry it all. Aye? Dorn got a huge disconcerting dwarven grin on his face. Aye. Ruji bought his wizarding component belt that was custom-made for the purpose. It was a wide belt with loops for a dozen vials and rings and hooks to attach dozens of small pouches. The opposite side had a holster made for a spell book to drop into and be latched in. He also bought a set of mortars and pestles, plus a custom grinding wheel for making his potions and reagents. He tells Dorn that he wants a small bit of every kind of mineral and oil in the shop. Topping off his purchase, he buys one of every book that Dorn has for sale. That is way more than the two of them can carry in one trip. Ruji explains that he will have the cat beast folk carry it all tomorrow evening since they all work for him, and Dorn just smirks at the remark. The total sale is 2 large gold, 3 small gold, and some change that Ruji just rounds up to 4 small gold. The pair got a ton of incredulous or overtly curious looks as they headed to the old Sleeping Tree Inn. The looks that they drew from Karen and Teresa were way better. It was worth the looks he had gotten all through town. Ruji and Dorn arrived back at the inn a little after noon, and there were only a few patrons left in the common room. Most of them appeared to be almost finished with their meal and would likely be leaving in the next 10 minutes by Ruji's estimate. There were some of the older ones that Ruji recognized as regulars who frequented the place like a bar. Regardless of whether they were a regular or just a lunch patron, they all turned to look at the odd pair trundling through the double swing doors with a mountain of book and odd items. When the regulars saw Ruji, they started to greet him, but then their eyes fell on the dwarf following him and their mouths fell open. Teresa was at the table of one of the regulars when she saw them all turning to look at the door and did likewise. She almost couldn't tell it was Ruji for the load of things he was carrying in front of him. Suddenly a voice boomed out behind him. Laddie, I willna be a lugging your materials up to your room for ye, hear? I'll be having ye know that I'm an old man and ma ol knees ain't gonna try keepin' up wi' your young elven behind Anna Moore. I told ye ta be slowin' your runnin' through the town. I'm leaving your stuff here and ye kin be getting your cat friends ta be doin' all the luggin' from now on. Ruji walked over to a seat at an empty table and set his load of items down before returning to take the stack from Dorn. Alright Dorn, I just wanted help getting the first of it too. The inn. Why don't you sit down and have an ale? I'll pay. Least I can do for the misunderstanding. Well, that and buying all of my supplies finally. I swear, I really didn't know that I could buy them yet. I thought I had to have your approval. Hey Teresa, can I get you to grab my master an ale or 3? I somehow don't think that he's a lightweight when it comes to drinking. Certainly not like me. Teresa went into the kitchen and looked wide-eyed at a concerned Karen, who was washing dishes. Karen, girl, we were wrong this morning. Your man is exactly what he said he was. I think you need to go out there and talk to him before he gets the wrong idea and goes running off on you. Karen came out of the kitchen to see a crowd gathered around Ruji and somebody seated at a table. The old man seated at the table looked to be a dwarf and everybody was crowded around trying to talk to him. Ruji just stood off to the side next to a huge stack of books and other things that looked like they belonged in a kitchen. When he spotted her, he walked over with a smile but still looked a little nervous and stopped after a couple steps, looking down and away. Karen had felt that her heart was going to shatter all morning and every time she imagined Ruji leaving, she just about broke down in tears and did a couple times. Teresa had been comforting her every time she broke down, but she really just wanted to be held by Ruji. When she saw him hesitating, it felt like a knife twisting in her gut and she couldn't hold herself back. Karen ran to him, tears streaming down her face. Ruji was expecting to receive a frosty welcome, figuring that Karen would still be mad at him. When she came out of the kitchen, he wanted to rush over to her and immediately start telling her about his day like he would normally, but then he remembered that they had a fight that morning and he wasn't as confident anymore. He hesitated, unsure just what he should do. Should he act as though nothing had happened? It seemed a little late for that. Should he begin with an apology? Should he? Fortunately, the question was answered for him when Karen broke down in tears and ran to him. He wrapped his arms around her, but her momentum carried them to the floor. He managed to stay upright, but they were now sitting on the floor in a heap with Karen bawling in his arms. That's when a usually gruff voice burst into his thoughts, due to its complete lack of gruffness this time. So that be the last what be talking up your thoughts. Aye, that's a right looker there. I can be a seein' why ye was distracted so this mornin'. And she seems to be leaking ye right fierce. Karen flinched as she remembered her current location. She was so lost in worries over losing her love with Ruji that she lost sight of everything except him. Suddenly her surroundings came rushing back and apparently, she had made a complete spectacle of herself and could feel her cheeks burning. Whatever, as long as she got to keep Ruji, the rest of the world could see her any way they wanted. Then the words that could only be from a dwarf caught her attention and she wiped her eyes before looking up at the speaker. Fortunately, Ruji didn't seem interested in letting go of her because she didn't want to be anywhere but next to him right now. When Karen looked at the owner of the voice, the words finally sunk in and she had to take a closer look. She was a bit overwhelmed when she realized who was sitting there. It was Dorn Fire Fist, the legendary war hero known as the Crimson Rain. A fire mage of the First Order who had a reputation for raining fire down on entire enemy formations, and an equally fearsome reputation for his adamant refusal to take any apprentices. Every person who had gone to see him was rejected as having no talent for magic, and the few times that a mage was sent as a test, they were found out within half a candle's pan. Karen turned to look up at Ruji with wide-eyed wonder. You weren't lying, were you? You really are the first apprentice that Dorn has ever taken? But why? How? Teresa was just arriving with a tray laden with 6 mugs of ale, which seemed strange until she grabbed one herself and began downing the contents. At Karen's comments and questions, everybody's eyes went straight to Ruji or Dorn and they all ended up on him as he began to speak. Oh aye. He be my apprentice lass and a right good 'un at that. This young'un here came to me shop and challenged me ta turn em down he did. Told me that I shoulda be given em a fair shot ta prove Tommy whether'n he be havin' talent or not. Sir, and I was determined ta be kickin' em out o' me shop, so I told em I did, ifing ye kinny be naming me the use of me rocks fair magic ye be leavin' and not a comin' back. Aye, and I'll be a goblin's uncle if'n he didn't start a naming a bunch o' the rocks. I didna recognize none o' the names he was a naming, but the details was straight as a dwarven tunnel they was. Everyone was now looking at Ruji in awe, and Karen had a look of reverence on her face as she snuggled even tighter to his chest with a smile. I just don't think you realized how stubborn you were being. I doubt that there are too many people who have some kind of innate knowledge of magic or a possible background in it that they can't remember. I think that you should at least give a potential apprentice a chance to prove that they have no talent before throwing them out. I mean, imagine how many of those you rejected that just might have some kind of talent that you passed up. Probably not most, mind you. But, would it hurt you to give them a wee an 8-day to show they have talent before you toss them out? Not that I'm saying that I want to give up my spot to another apprentice, mind you, but I will finish my apprenticeship at some point, and then you could give somebody else a chance to earn their apprenticeship. Doran looked thoughtfully at Ruji, still tackled to the floor, and he had to admit, he had been getting a bit too callous with his assessment of people having no talent. Maybe, having an apprentice or two around wouldn't be all that bad. Aye laddie. I be thinkin' ye may be right. I havena been givin' folks a fair chance at that. And I be agreein' ta your terms. From now on lad, I'll be a givin' the green UNS a fair shot ta be a provin' what I already knew about most o' the lot. But if I be a findin' me another lad or lass what has any talent, I'll be a teachin' em right. I best be a getting ready then. I dinny thin ye'll be needin' me guidance fair much more, maybe a pair o' 8 days at most. Ye be havin' no problems a learnin' on your lonesome, and ye just bought me entire stock o' know-how anyway. Just do me a favor and don't be a opening a shop fair teachin' now that I done got it in ma head ta be givin' it a try. Aye? Ruji couldn't help but smile at that, but was a little shocked. Doran thought he would be ready in a couple 8 days. That was much sooner than he was prepared for. He was right though, he did have all the basics of caster magic down and even had a secret that Doran probably couldn't replicate. If he was going to be out the door so soon, he decided that he needed to concentrate on getting the basics of summoner and enchanter magic. The only thing he could say to Doran was "I." Ruji nudged Karen, who reluctantly let go of him. She looked at him and then the smile registered and she realized that he was focused solely on her right now. This feeling was like the first warm rays of sun after the winter snow. She was determined now, even if he was already married, she would stay by his side as a mistress or even less as long as he would look at her that way. But he seemed excited to show her something judging by the grin on his face. It was the same one he had any time he was playing a prank on her or telling her really good news. Ruji was so relieved that Karen wasn't still mad at him, he felt like he was floating a kilometer off the ground. He wanted to share that feeling, and he was pretty sure that Karen already felt it, but if not, maybe the present would help. He had gotten it for her anyway, so no use in keeping it to himself. The page contained some of the most beautiful lines she had ever heard and realized that this was a book of poetry. Only then did the title click in her mind, and she had to look at the cover again to make sure. Lustrous pink was actually well known to be very hard to get a hold of due to the graphic nature of the poetry in it. The author was always assumed to be a man because the contents were downright lewd, but Karen and a lot of other women were certain, due to the sheer beauty of the poetry, that the author was a woman. How had he gotten a complete copy? Karen had heard that a lot of the volumes for sale were half the size and only contained the rare few tame poems or those that could be rewritten without any of the wording that made them so lewd. The one poem that she had heard from the original made the fakes pale in comparison. Now she had a whole copy all her own. Suddenly, Karen realized that she was crying again and looked up to see Ruji smiling at her. Then he pointed at what had seemed a nondescript box held in the middle of the stack of books. Now that it had been revealed, her jaw dropped and her heart just about stopped. Sitting on top of the pile of books was the single most beautiful box she had ever laid eyes on. The box was made of a very dark wood that probably didn't come from anywhere around Lyril. The darkness only served to highlight the pinkish opalescent inlays in the lid and sides of the box. The box was almost the size of both of her hand lengths wide and about 1 deep. With the lid closed, it was about half a hand tall and the inlays were of various different flowers. Then he unlatched and opened the lid and she was left stunned once again. There were various brushes, pads, and linens in the central compartment with a dazzling array of makeup infusions along the top and bottom. In the top of the lid was a most remarkable mirror, so clear that she had never seen the like. Karen was sure that he must have paid in gold for these 2 items, and as the enormity of the gift struck her, Karen found her legs going weak and Ruji had to hold her up. That was fine with both of them though. After some time, when Karen had regained her composure a bit, they were all settled at one of the tables. Most of the patrons had lost interest after the love show was over and had left, probably to tell as many people as they could about this bit of juicy gossip. Teresa, Dorn, Karen, Ruji, and for some reason, 2 of the regulars, sat around the table drinking ale and discussing things. Teresa was sitting next to Dorn and when she didn't think anybody was looking, she would stare down at him. The look reminded Ruji of some older people he once knew who would get a nostalgic look in their eyes while looking at various things. There was something else there, he was pretty sure it was desire, and when she looked over at him, she blushed. He thought it was a neat change to be the one rooting for someone else's love life. He looked to Karen and she had the same kind of look on her face, so she was probably thinking the same thing he was. After a bit more chat about innocuous things, Ruji steered the conversation into a direction where he could broach a special subject. He asked Dorn if he knew any spells that would be useful for making a bathhouse. Teresa's eyes came alive and she was practically beaming. Dorn thought it over and named out a couple ways of doing things, but the problem was powering the enchantments. Ruji and Dorn went back and forth with ideas and eventually pulled out a sheet of paper and began scribbling notes on it. The discussion took several hours and was very in-depth. Both Teresa and Karen had to excuse themselves to make supper. Strangely, one of the regular pair turned out to be an enchanter of some small skill and threw into the conversation in return for a stream of refills. Ruji left a silver on his and Dorn's tab, which would take a bit of time to drink away. The problem of power was because the spells were only meant to be thrown down where a set amount of power was required for the spell to produce an effect. Ruji opened the book on enchantment runes, and the basics of the spell to produce water were quickly laid out. Another enchantment was drawn out that would produce heat for the water. What Ruji saw in front of him was a simple set of programming operators. They meant things like and, or, this, or, true, false, as well as a bunch of simple arithmetic operators. This changed the way he looked at the spells on a fundamental level and he began wondering about their creation. Ruji only had the most basic of programming knowledge from a single semester of computer sciences. The basic ideas were all the same though. It was a good thing they were basic, because that's all the knowledge he had on the subject. He wondered briefly why these existed in enchanting but not in caster or summoner magics, but it was pretty obvious, writing the spell took too much time if you had all this in it. Caster and summoner magic had to be performed quickly, while enchanter magic could be planned meticulously and was usually made beforehand. Ruji began writing a new set of glyphic scripts for the idea he just had using these operators. He was so absorbed in his work he almost didn't notice when Karen sat a bowl of stew next to him with a butter loaf and a side of steaming vegetables. He took a break to eat with Karen while Dorn and the other mage looked over his scripts. The pair just kept exclaiming about how they didn't see how this or that would work. Karen sat the food in front of Ruji, and at first, she didn't think he saw it at all. He was so absorbed in the spell that he was working on, she could finally understand how he was having a hard time finding time to do everything, and his studies did look to be rather strenuous and time-consuming. As she was setting the stew down, she looked over the magic stuff he was writing and it made no sense to her, and then she heard Dorn saying that it made no sense to him and felt a little bad for Ruji. For him to be praised so highly earlier and now this. Before she could pull her hand back, his shot out and grabbed hers, and he smiled up at her. He looked at the tray and when he noticed 2 sets of food, he began pulling her down into the seat beside him. Karen was only too happy to sit with him and share a meal together. She spent most of the meal snuggled up next to him, and he even went so far as to feed her before she got embarrassed and sat up straight to a chorus of chuckles. Ruji managed to make some progress on the magic script after supper. The basics of the script revolved around if-then statements. If the person had magic, then the circle would activate. If the person had enough mana to fully empower the spell, then it would all come out at once. If the mana was insufficient, then it would be drawn at a percentage rate until the person reached 1/4 of their mana. If there were multiple people, then the spell would siphon mana from them in proportion to their reserves of mana. That was the basics of the script that he set up to run the water creation and water heating spell. He then drew up a counter spell that would deactivate the water production once it reached where that spell was to be inscribed on the side of the tub. This one would only take a tiny amount of mana. It would have to be charged ahead of time and would activate once the water reached the desired depth. Ruji had a bit more trouble with the heating spell. The problem was that there didn't seem to be any way of making a reliable thermostat. There were no values of temperature in the language besides ice and fire or hot and cold. Ruji considered the problem from a percentage base and decided that trying for a percentage of body temperature wouldn't really work fundamentally, because as the person bathed their temp would rise and then so would the percentage. For a long time, Ruji was stumped and was just laying his head on the table, in a funk. He was staring absently off into the distance when he saw Karen approaching a table with a tray of food. His own table was garnering a lot of the conversation for the evening, so he hadn't bothered listening in. Suddenly, his eyes caught on one aspect of the meal they were being served. There was steam rising from the stew, and that's when it hit him. He would use steam as the indicator for the spell to turn on and off. If the spell detected steam, it would turn the heat spell off, and if the water cooled to the point it wasn't steaming, it would be turned back on. Ruji finished the scripting for the tub, and when he explained the concept for it, he thought that both of the mages were going to faint. They both went almost white before turning to look at one another and back to him. Almost in perfect unison, they yelled, "What?" Dorn explained that without bothering to stop at this part, Ruji had managed to make a glyphic script that could be used to gauge someone's mana capacity. They seemed to find this to be among the greater contributions to magic in recent history. They began arguing over how to have the final spell express the outcome of spell. Ruji asked them to list the types of currency, and they looked at him a little perplexed. Ruji was prompted to explain. What if the spell triggered a series of illumination spells that ranged from bottom to top in the 10 categories of currency? Someone with too little mana wouldn't trigger the spell at all, but the next lowest amount would register as a small copper. The next level of mana would be a large copper, then a small silver, then a large silver, then a small gold, large gold, cobalt, mithril, orichalcum, and finally dragonite. Although, I doubt anyone except a dragon would likely trigger that level. The concept was finalized, and the three began working on the exact magic circle inscriptions to make it work. They then continued with the work on the bathhouse enchantments. It took a very long time to finalize the concepts, and the three of them fell asleep at the table. Ruji woke to the feeling of Karen hoisting him up from his chair and walking him to the stairs. He was only mildly buzzed earlier and had only finished perhaps 2 mugs of ale. He had fallen asleep because he was just tired, but he wasn't going to tell Karen that. When she had pushed him into his bed, he half expected that she might give him a kiss, but he definitely didn't expect what happened. Instead of kissing him, she then sat on the side of his bed and took her own boots off before crawling under the cover with him. She proceeded to cuddle up next to him and pulled his arm over the top of her. He was reminded of times when his older sister, Haruko, would get in his bed during the coldest parts of winter. He drifted off to sleep thinking of his family that he would almost certainly never see again. Ruji was awakened well before dawn to a bleary-eyed Karen looking around confused before her beautiful black eyes settled on his own eyes, and she leaned in and kissed him long and deeply while brushing her golden hair out of her eyes. Then she got out of his bed and put her boots on in the chair. After that, she leaned over him in the pale light of the moon streaming through his window and whispered into his ear. "Go back to sleep, my dear elven lord. It's far too early for you to be awake." I've got to go get my little brother up and get him to work now, so go back to bed. Ruji almost drifted off to sleep before her words hit him and he sprang wide awake. What? You have a brother? You didn't tell me you had family. I mean, I assumed that you had family, but just maybe not in this town or something. Can I meet him? Karen blinked several times in surprise before covering her mouth and giggling. I suppose. They have been interested to meet you, but I didn't want to bother you. If you meet my little brother and my little sisters, you'll have to put up with them asking an endless string of questions. Are you sure? In answer to her question, Ruji jumped out of bed and began putting his shoes on. So why haven't you told me about your family? I mean, I would tell you if I knew anything about my family. All I have is that I had a dad who worked all the time, a mom that was always sick, and an older sister who taught me a lot of things. I can't remember their names or where we lived though. Karen looked a little bashful, but finally relented. I didn't want you to feel like you would be stuck with all of my siblings if you got involved with me. I didn't want you to feel like you had to support my family. I don't ever want to be a burden to you. Ruji stepped in and wrapped his arm around Karen's waist, pulling her close and kissing her deeply before leaning back a little to look her in the eyes. I don't ever want you to worry about troubling me financially. I may have talent with magic, but I have a gift with money. Okay? Karen seemed to be thinking this statement over, but Ruji just pulled out a small gold as he put his sword belt on. The key and infinite coin pouch already resecured to it. When he handed the coin to her, Karen looked at him with confusion for a second before realization hit her and she immediately tried to give it back. I have business deals all over town and I have several that are now making a great deal of money. I won't miss a gold coin, I promise. Now, I believe you told me you didn't have any soap. What else is there that you and your siblings don't have? I suppose this is insensitive, but your parents and family, are they all gone, or is there some other situation you didn't want to bother me with? Karen was just opening the door but stopped and looked over her shoulder at him for a second before dropping her head and shaking it. No, we're all orphans now. My mother died giving birth to my youngest sister and my father was killed protecting a caravan of traders from bandits a couple years later. I don't think either of my parents had any brothers or sisters and nobody ever came forward to help us when it happened, so I doubt it. I've been the only one keeping my family alive for a long time. I really should return your money, but we really do need it, so I will take the gift, and if you want something in return I will give it, gladly. I don't have much, but I'll give you whatever I can. Ruji felt bad for steering the conversation in such a depressing direction, so he pushed her gently out the door to change the mood. Good. Then I will ask you to give me your cooperation in supporting a certain family of orphans. Right now, I would like you to give me an introduction. I may count on you for other minor tasks later as well. Karen pulled out a key she had around her neck and walked to the next room down on the opposite side of the hall. She opened the door slowly and peeked in. It was still dark out, so he assumed that Karen was the one who usually lit all the lamps. She stepped inside and Ruji could make out her hand gesturing for him to follow her. Once he got to the door, he could see that, unlike his room, there was almost no space in this one. There were 2 beds pushed next to one another and asleep under the covers were 3 children that Ruji could barely make out. Ruji looked to Karen and she had a warm smile on her face as she watched the 3 sleeping forms. Ruji looked around the rest of the room, but it was too dark to make anything but vague shapes out, but he was curious about the human shape in the far corner. Just to be cautious, Ruji had his hand on the handle of his dagger since it would be easier to pull out and use in a tight space. Karen kneeled on the floor and pulled out something from under the bed, and when it scraped over the floor the children stirred and a high-pitched female-sounding voice whispered out. Sis, is that you? Where were you last night? Sachi kept asking all night and didn't want to go to sleep until you got back. Karen used some kind of striker and sparks showered over the wick of a small lamp. She had to do that 3 times before the lamp lit, and as she held it up, bathing the room in light, she spoke while Ruji got his first look at both the surroundings and the 3 children in the beds. Sorry Rin, I should have come here and tucked her in myself. This is Ruji. I hate to ask, but I need you to go get the oil and refill all the lamps now. The young girl sitting up staring at Ruji had dark brown eyes and dirty blonde hair, but otherwise, she looked almost just like Karen. When she first got a look at Ruji, she had been captivated, but once her sister asked her to immediately get to work, she had a dejected look on her pretty features. But sis, that's not fair. Can't I just? Karen cut her off, ruffling her hair. I promise that you'll get a chance to talk to him when you're done. Besides, I need you to wake Dorn Fire Fist. He just happens to be Ruji's master and he's downstairs right now. Ruji had to interject at that. I wouldn't do that. You should know a little something. He sleeps fairly late, and if he's disturbed before he's ready to wake up, he's liable to throw a fireball at you. It's so bad, he has to have an enchantment on his entire shop to keep him from blowing it up in his sleep. Ruji grinned at the girl, who was about 10, as her eyes went wide in wonder, and Karen shot him a smirk. What? It's true. I have to fill the enchantment with mana every few days. But I'll tell you what, I know someone who probably is awake about now. When you finish the oil and your other chores, we'll go see Lisbeth at the bakery and see what this will buy. Ruji pulled out a small silver from his pouch and held it up to Rin's amazement, but only once you're done. The girl was out of bed and stripping her clothes in seconds. Karen blushed and scrambled to try to cover her with a shirt as she changed into her clothes for the day. Ruji sniggered and turned away slightly from the immodest girl, but noted with distaste that the clothes she was reaching for in the chest under the bed had patches all over them. Time to spend some more coinage and get the kiddos some decent clothing. Then he shuddered and reminded himself that he had to deal with his own problem first, and then he could worry about the rest of the town. Karen woke her, maybe 13-year-old, brother Ken up, and he was just as full of questions as she had said. While he was rapid-firing questions off the youngest of the siblings, Sachi, who looked to be about 6 or 7, awoke and had barely peeking out of the covers at him. When he introduced himself, she did a 180 and was just as full of questions as her brother. Ruji asked Karen where Ken worked and found out it was at the Ready Laborers Guild. The Ready Labor Guild was a place that specialized in non-dangerous odd job work. The members of the guild might be doing any number of tasks from one day to the next. The only commonality in the tasks was that they never put the persons taking the quest in harm's way. The Mercenaries Guild filled that role. Ruji answered what questions he could as he began looking around the room at the Spartan living space. The largest portion of the room was taken up by the 2 beds next to each other. There was only a meter of space between the bed and the wall, and in that space was a chest on a very short dresser with only 2 drawers that were side by side. There were also things, like the chest with the lamp, stuffed under the beds. There was only one thing in the room that looked totally out of place. It was an armor stand with a nice set of leather armor on it and a full spear in the corner. He realized that he needed to get a stand like that for his own armor and wondered if the furniture store could make one. Ruji guessed that it and the armor on it probably belonged to their father before he was killed, as he was sure that some of the other things in the room had. He shivered at the grim line of thought and was reminded how tough life was here, but that wasn't why he was here in Karen's room. The 2 children kept asking for Ruji to show them a spell, even though Karen told them to stop. The 3rd time that he was asked the same request, Ruji relented. Okay, but only after we get you 2 dressed and are ready to go to the bakery. I'll show you a special spell I only learned yesterday. However, it's not fair to show you and not your sister, so hurry up and finish getting ready. The 2 had done the same as their sister and simply began stripping without reservation. Ruji was sure that if he weren't here that Karen would be just as unreserved as her younger siblings, which gave him an idea, and he got a grin. So, weren't you going to change too? Were you going to strip like they did? Ruji's words made Karen turn bright red, and she tried to stammer out a reply before noticing the grin in profile. She got to her feet and thumped the tip of his right ear again. This made him wince and the children laugh. Then she brushed up close so only he could hear before whispering in his ear. Maybe later. It was his turn to blush, and he was about to stammer out a response when he saw the malicious grin that was easily the match for his own plastered across her entrancing features. Ruji knew that he had been played and turned a deeper shade of red, and Karen joined her siblings in laughing. Oh, very cute. Off with you now if you're all finished getting dressed. When they went out into the hall, Rin was just finishing up the last of the lamps on the second floor. She looked imploringly at her older sister, but Karen just pointed at the stairs and she trudged up them with a clay jug in one hand and a lit lamp with a long nose in the other. We'll wait for you to finish at the bottom of the stairs. Rin brightened at that and ascended the stairs a little faster. The rest of them went down the stairs and waited there. Ruji noted that the regulars were gone, but Dorn was still there. The problem was that he was laying on the floor, prompting Ruji to wonder if there was any of that silver left on his tab. Maybe he took it as a challenge to finish it all in one night. Either way, somebody, probably Teresa, had draped a couple blankets over his sleeping form and stuffed a pillow under his head. He actually looked quite peaceful and amazingly, he wasn't snoring. Karen seemed conflicted about something and Ruji asked about it. What's wrong? You look like you want something, but don't want to say it. Just tell me. Karen looked abashed and turned away before explaining. I need to get the fire started in the oven and start a pot of water boiling for the patrons to wash up with. I also need to set something out for breakfast, but I guess that could be some of the bread we had delivered yesterday if I just make some sweet cream butter to go on it. It's just, well, I don't want to miss your spell either. I really want to see too, you know? Ruji leaned over and kissed her deeply, and he could hear 3 gasps, 2 from beside them and 1 from the stairs behind them. He didn't let her go just because of that, and when he finally did let go of the back of her neck, she had her eyes closed and was panting and shuddering with a big smile on her deeply flushed face. How about that for timing? Now I guess you can see the spell with your brother and sisters. I even had an idea. This is going to save you some time, I think. Go put the wood in the oven and then I'll light it with the spell I was going to show you. Then you can put the pot on it and I'll fill it up with water too. Karen looked like she was too out of it to register what he had said, but she turned after a moment and headed for the kitchen. Ruji looked around and the 2 girls were both looking at him with their hands clasped together under their chins and looked to be lost in romantic fantasies. More startling yet, Ken seemed to have a look of hero worship written on his features with his wide eyes glued on Ruji just as much as his sister's eyes were. Ruji just smirked and waved for them to follow him and Karen to the kitchen. Once Karen had piled a few log wedges into the oven, she went back to get the smaller stuff to put under it. When she came back with the branches, twigs, and kindling, Ruji told her she wouldn't need the smaller stuff at all. She just sat it aside in favor of not delaying his show of spells. Ruji had to concentrate to pull the hydrogen and oxygen into a point on his fingertip, but then he began drawing his spell. Immediately, all 4 of them gasped or oohed. Ruji didn't realize at the time, because he was so focused on spell, but Karen was suddenly watching him like a hawk. When he quickly completed the spell circle and it flared a brilliant blue in flame and the small but very intense blue-white flame appeared on his fingertip, there were a chorus of cheers and chatter. Ruji played with the spell on his fingertips for a couple seconds to amuse the children, then he lit the wood in the stove with it. The heat of the small hydrogen-oxygen flame was so intense that the fire sprang to the wood almost at once. And Ruji heard Karen gasp. She was looking at the flame on his fingers and hadn't moved from where she was a moment ago. Ruji wondered from her rapid breathing if he had done something wrong. His worry was proven to be well-founded a moment later. As he closed his hand and the flame went out, Karen looked from his hand to his face with wide eyes. Then she voiced her concern in a hesitant whisper. Ruji, how is it that you can make fire with a wind spell? I may not have seen a lot of magic and I'm not a mage, but I'm certain that that's not how it's supposed to work. Ruji grinned at her and put his finger across his lips and shushed her. He was a little confused when she just looked at him confused. He soon discovered that the local equivalent of shushing someone was pinching your fingers shut in front of your mouth. Karen had gotten over her shock and was very grateful when Ruji filled the pot with water. She explained that the water pump had to be primed and it was a lot of pumping to get a big pot of water full. With the show over, Karen shooed them all out the door. Ruji then took them all to the bakery where Lisbeth happily set out the 2 freshly baked loaves of berry bread. She got quite cross with Ruji for trying to pay her. She and her daughters were all only too happy to fawn over Karen's siblings. Ruji just regretted that they had to walk around in what amounted to rags. Lisbeth produced some butter from somewhere and they all laid into the freshly baked berry bread. Ken said his goodbyes while wiping the butter from his face, and the rest of them prepared to head back to the inn. Once they were back, Ruji and the children all went back upstairs to bathe, while Karen put the slices of berry bread away with great relish. The rest, she plated for Teresa and Dorn as per Ruji's instructions. Ruji was greeted by a line waiting to get to the privy and the steaming hot water. As they stood in line, one of the people closer to the pot remarked how the water seemed different from normal, like it had no smell of the river in it. Ruji and the girls smirked at one another. Just about the time the three of them made it to the privy, Karen topped the stairs. Teresa must have awakened, and he guessed it was time that he woke Dorn up, once his bath was done. He couldn't wait to take a real bath again. After bathing, as much as one could call it that, Ruji changed into a new outfit. He chose the blue one because he thought it looked more elegant and expensive than the rest. He put on his wizarding belt and filled a few of the vials with various reagents, and even powdered a couple real quick to fill out the spaces left. He didn't have a dedicated spell book, so he just used the notebook that he had been ripping pages out of. That reminded him of the pages strewn all over the table downstairs, and he rushed down after locking his door. Dorn was already sitting at the table with bleary eyes and a queasy greenish face. Ruji came over and sat down, gathering up all the loose pages. There were already people chattering about the pair of them at other tables. Ruji ignored it and went about putting the research papers away in his book. Karen came out and, seeing his attire, just whistled and shook her head approvingly. Dorn, hearing the whistle, clutched his head and she winced. Ruji suggested going to the privy and Dorn grimaced. He then said that going in there would likely make him puke, and Ruji replied that was the idea. Dorn almost puked at that and then ran upstairs to the privy anyway. Shaking his head and grinning, Ruji went to leave but stopped to tell Karen that she should wait to give Dorn's stomach time to settle down before putting food in front of him. She agreed readily to that idea. After talking to Karen again, Ruji was reminded that even though he had managed to allay her fears, he still had to figure the whole werewolf thing out. Ruji then got worried about what he would do if he turned into a werewolf while he was in the library. He considered this for a second, then asked Karen if there was any ham in the cold storage cellar. When she confirmed that there was some cured ham there, he asked to buy a bit of it. She looked at him a bit strange till he followed up by asking if he could also get a couple bread loaves and some cheese since he would be busy at lunch. Karen agreed and he pulled out a small silver. She started to say it was too much, but as usual, he was already headed to the stairs. He ran up the stairs and went into his room just as Dorn was leaving the privy with a look of relief on his face. Ruji grabbed his smallest satchel that would be too small to put a book in and was about to leave the room when he thought better of it. He took out the notes from last night and stored them away in the drawer of his bedside table. He then went down and Karen had everything he wanted wrapped up in a linen that he stored in his small satchel. He pulled out his map and had Dorn mark the library on it, then got up to leave. He gave Karen one last passionate kiss that drew whistles and jeers alike before leaving. It didn't take long to find the library. He headed down the main highway as though he were going to the city's south gate exit. When he got close enough to see the rusty iron gate in the distance, he separated from the crowd that was headed out of the gate and made his way to the left edge, and turned down a wide lane into the midst of the nobles' district. He got a lot of looks from the lumbering crowd as he did so. Ruji also attracted the gazes of a couple of the guards from the town watch who made directly for him. The pair were wearing the familiar monster leather armor with half-plate greaves, gauntlets, and breastplates, but they weren't familiar to Ruji. So he did the smart thing and stopped, waiting on them to walk up to him. The one closer to him took on a bored attitude as he gave his challenge. "Halt, what's your business here?" Ruji couldn't help but smirk at his choice of wording and decided to have a bit of fun. "Oh, that one there." At which point, he pointed to a slightly dilapidated building just a little ahead on the left. His actual goal was the library to the far left just past the building, but the one he had pointed out would prove a funnier goal for the moment. The guard looked over his shoulder at the building in obvious confusion, just as the other one got there and asked the obvious question. What's going on? G1, he says that he's going to the building over there. G2 then ran him off. That place is abandoned. He's got no business there. But I do have a business there, or at least I will in the future. G2, listen, sir. There isn't anything there for you, so just go back the way you came. Ruji could tell that the man didn't want to say sir at all and was getting frustrated. Best to end his joke quickly. No. You see, that is my business there. I own it, the building that is. Suddenly, Ruji heard a voice from behind him. You guys have a problem here? Ruji turned to see another guard strolling up, and this one seemed to be a higher rank. Did he look familiar? Yeah, maybe. Just then the first guard spoke up. This guy says that he owns the building over there. Have you heard anything about this, Captain? The new guard's eyes opened wide when he got a look at Ruji. Hey, it's you. You were the guy that caught that mangy murdering merchant with some magic potion. Wow, you own that building now? I don't want to seem like I'm being suspicious, but do you have any proof? Ruji smirked at him. I don't have the title with me, but would the key to the building do? Or maybe if I were to swear by this? Ruji pulled up the gold and silver pendant on the gold chain around his neck, and he could hear the other two gulp and saw them look at each other out of the corner of his eye. You two move and let his lordship through. Be sure to tell all the rest of the watch that his lordship owns property in the nobles district when you change shifts. I'll go with you and test the flooring for weak spots, my lord. Ruji chuckled and started to walk off, but then stopped and turned around. The guys from the town watch stopped too, and Ruji could just see a sinking feeling on their faces. The first two were getting ready to either get chewed out by a noble or something worse. The captain was preparing to step in and try taking the heat off of his men even at the cost of his own hide. Ruji looked between the two and waved dismissively. I was teasing you. It's not your fault, or at least not totally your fault. Be more careful about being dismissive of people. Some nobles enjoy baiting people into saying things they might regret, and most of them that do that kind of thing don't just want a bit of a laugh. Oh, and ask the orc guard about what it means to be guarding the gate while you're at it. I sincerely hope you have a better day from here out. Ruji turned just in time to see the captain replace a contemplative grin with a look of total seriousness. Ruji couldn't help calling him out on it with a grin. You're not fooling anybody. Come on, let's go see what my new building looks like on the inside. The inside of the building was actually very sparse and in a lot better shape than the guard captain had expected. There were half a dozen thick marble columns spaced in a double row down the middle of the building, basically trisecting it. There was also the anteroom that was half the size of the main portion of the building. Ruji saw so much potential in this design, and there was almost nothing he would need to do to the building to get it ready. He did want the door to connect to the anteroom instead of the main area, but that was about it. He thanked the guard captain and told him that he wanted to look at a few more things before he left. The captain had asked about the techniques of questioning prisoners while they were looking. He apparently thought there was some magic involved and was disappointed when he was told that it was just looking for people's bad habits and tells the same as a gambler would. Ruji suspected that he wasn't a good gambler and wasn't able to memorize all the tells and was secretly hoping that he could learn some inside trick. Once the guard captain was gone, Ruji unwrapped and ate a bit of the ham. He used his dagger to cut off 2 thick slices and then ate the rest. He was feeling overly full, but decided it was still better than the alternative. No need to be turning into a werewolf in the library, after all. Now he just needed to get a look at the actual library and then go to the money changer. Ruji exited the old building and made his way over to the library that was practically adjoined to it. Ruji saw that the two buildings were only separated by a meter or less as he passed, barely even a crawl space. As such, it didn't take him very long to reach the front entrance of the library. The library had the most artistically creative window shutters he had seen in the whole city. Each window shutter was taller than the window on top and bottom, and the pair was made to look like an open book with the center cut out to frame the window. The rest of the building was the same melted rock with wood above it, and since it was the nobles' district, it was topped in the corroded bronze-like metal roofing. The front of the library was split in the center, by the entrance. The entrance itself was almost as tall as the building and recessed into the face of the building with a column on each side, as much for decoration as support. Just to the side of the entrance on the left side was a booth that looked like it had to be entered from the inside of the building. The front of the booth was open with a grate in front of it where a person could reach through a bit but not far, and those inside could see out and could be seen. The huge ornate double doors were carved in a relief featuring a bunch of books and was painted and plated with bits of peeling goldish metal. The setup reminded him of the front of a movie theater. This was definitely the main entrance meant for nobility. Having located the entrance to the library, Ruji left for the money changers and began pulling out the small silver that he would need. He wanted to have the 48 small silvers that he would need to get the 6 large ones and a few extra just for the heck of it, but these went in the other pouch with all the rest of his random currency. The library didn't appear to be open yet anyway. The walk wasn't long and he arrived in front of the gaudiest building in the city. The money changers building was painted with a huge bag of coins on the front that took up most of the front of the building. Ruji was relieved again that the inside didn't match the outside. He looked and once again Shone was busy. This time, however, Ruji went over to one of the clerks who was trying not to be too obvious about begging him with her eyes. He sat at the desk of the attractive young elf of a rather indeterminate race. She looked almost like a sun elf, but her ears were very short and her hair was black. All the sun elves that Ruji had seen so far were blonde with very light eyes and long ears. Ruji pulled the latch on his belt that was holding the already prepared amount, then sat it on her desk. "I would like this in large silver, please. There is one in there for you also." As she ran off, Ruji was left wondering again how the clerks who worked here were usually paid. He guessed that perhaps they survived on tips, but doubted that. Maybe they were paid by the city out of taxes collected? A moment later, his musings were interrupted as the young woman came back with his pouch and 6 large silvers. He finally figured out the obvious: this girl was a half-elf, one of her parents was a human, and the other an elf. This is perhaps what he could expect if he had children with Karen. He realized he was staring when she blushed. "Sorry, your beauty enraptured me for a moment. I hope you have a pleasant day." Ruji left as the clerk in question turned a much deeper shade of crimson. He arrived back at the library without incident. The guards from before just nodded to him as he passed. When he arrived, he was gratified to discover that the booth in the front of the library was occupied. He walked up to the window without delay and was about to address the thin man on the other side when said individual interrupted him. "And what do you want? I don't know how you got past the town watch, but I can assure you that this isn't where you meant to go. This is the Great Library of Lyril. It costs 6 large silver to enter this facility, so unless you have that much, you should be on your way." Ruji was pissed and considered accosting the man with magic, but he didn't need that problem right now. Instead, he simply took out the 6 large silver and slammed them on the counter with such force that the twerp yelped. The man's eyes widened as he looked at the 6 large silver. He then looked at Ruji's face and almost yelped again as the scowl registered. Suddenly, his entire demeanor changed to that of a simpering toady. The guy started to bleed out some drivel and Ruji cut him off cold with 3 words. "Open the doors." The man came around and opened the doors and was about to continue trying to fix his asinine mistake, but when he saw the look he was getting, he obligingly shut his mouth. Ruji walked past him without saying a word and immediately began perusing the library. The inside of the library was a bit sparser than Ruji was expecting. There were shelves on every wall, but only one shelf bisected the floor space of the wing to either side of the door, and there were only 2 shelves facing him end-on in the back wing. Each all was easily 4 meters wide, and the bookshelves weren't even that full. The whole place looked to be only about 70% full, even excusing the enormous lack of shelves. As if to make up for its woeful lack of reading material, each all had numerous pedestals displaying helmets, swords, crystals, and any number of other random artifacts. There were also a good number of rather plush and comfortable chairs inset into the bookcases with some form of crystals hanging over them. Ruji approached the lone man walking about the library as the toady scurried back to his post at the door. The man was tall, exceptionally tall. Ruji estimated that he had to be almost 3 meters tall, and his arms were rather well muscled where they came out of his floor-length white robe. Despite the muscle, he was still very thin for his height, and Ruji began to wonder if he was a human who was too tall or a small giant of some kind. This was obviously the librarian, since he was pushing a cart of books and was putting them back on shelves here and there. Ruji was gratified to find that there was at least some kind of order to the place. He was really hoping to find a lot more information contained in a building this big, but he would settle for what he could get, provided they had the info he wanted. As he got closer, the tall individual turned a bit and regarded him before turning to him fully and giving him a cross-armed salute. Ruji began to wonder just what the significance of the salute was, since not everyone used it. Ruji wasn't sure about returning the salute and settled for a verbal thanks. He then retreated to one of the recessed chairs and looked it over. The whole area was rather dim and none of the chairs were close to a window. Ruji sat in one of the chairs and looked up at the crystal hanging above his head and noticed that there was a spell circle etched into the metal plate the crystal was hanging from. Right in the center of it, where the chain was hanging down, was the glyph for light. Understanding was instant, and he reached up and channeled mana into the crystal, which lit up in a bright yellowish light. The book was a thick tome that barely fit in his hand. It was old and had a brown leather cover. The pages were yellowed and the edges of them were rough cut. The layout of the contents was pretty standard for this world though. He was, therefore, able to flip pretty much right to the information he wanted. The informational portion of the tome was after the author's litany about his, amend that, her virtues as a scholar, and the introduction to the subject matter of the book. The second could be seen as a summary of the book acting as a table of contents of sorts. Then the informative portion was next. This was where the dry information was presented. Later would be the narrative, which is where any story elements would be and would be followed by the summation, basically the author's take on everything. The way these people wrote books made a bit more sense when you remembered that a lot of books were transcribed from other languages and by different races or even from different cultures entirely. The books must look fairly odd to some of the other cultures too now that he thought about it. And when you consider that a lot of the people who transcribe books don't have a book on hand to translate all the time, the author's introduction was their way of drumming up business for future projects. He quickly read through the fact portion and found out all the most relevant facts very quickly. First, werewolves could only transmit the disease if they were in their final 2 forms, and then it was by claws, as a bite was almost always fatal. Second, werewolves had 4 forms. The first form was their original form. The second was a half-form that looked much like a wolf-beast folk, but usually very feral and a little on the large side. He had already gotten experience with that one, so nothing new there. What was new was that the original form could even be a wolf-beast folk and they would be able to be distinguished from their original form. The other 2 forms couldn't be taken until after the first full moon, and it didn't matter if the person was clawed a day or a lunar cycle before the full moon. The third form was full werewolf form and would stand on average half again as tall as the base species. Ooh, he was going to be as big as the giant librarian? The last form was a full wolf form but was almost as large as a dire wolf in stature and was thought to be the progenitor species of the disease. The final form could neither pass for a normal wolf due to its size nor as a dire wolf owing to its lack of bony protrusions. Neat, bonus info on dire wolves there. The next section left Ruji feeling a sudden chill as he read it. A werewolf was incomplete till their first full moon and thus couldn't control their shape changing. The person in question would slowly lose control of their form until the day before the full moon. On that day, the person would transform into their third form and become wild, reckless, angry, and violent. In this state, a person would attack those around them indiscriminately and would often commit murders and atrocities that caused them to be hunted down and killed. How much time did he have left? He had no idea how much time there was until the next full moon. As far as he could tell, the people of the kingdom had no notion of months, only seasons and 8-day weeks. He went looking for the librarian and asked about the lunar cycle. Crap, Japanese, time to try a different wording. When he asked how long until the next full moon, the man thought for a second and then replied in a deep resonant bass. The reply made Ruji's blood run cold. In 6 more days. He only had 5 more days till he would become a ravenous beast? Ruji's mind was left reeling and he stumbled out the doors. The annoying man in the booth was saying something about having to pay every time you enter, but he ignored him. Ruji went stumbling along the wall of the library, his mind a mess of confusion and doubt. Then he hit upon a horrifying thought: what if he hurt Karen, or worse? The imagining of that was enough to send his overfull stomach over the edge, and he barely stumbled into the tiny alleyway between the library and his building before he began to empty the contents, violently.